Single dad pawned. Dead mom's ring for diapers. The old customer behind him whispered, "That was my sister." And in that one heartbeat, the broke young father realized the stranger behind him wasn't just watching his pain, he was holding the key to a family secret that would change both their lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The rain drummed steadily against the sidewalk as Eli Turner stood frozen, his worn work boots planted on the wet concrete. The plastic bag from the drugstore crinkled in his grip, the few diapers inside barely worth what he'd just given up. His heart pounded as the elderly man with the cane took a careful step toward him. "Please," Walter said, his voice gentle despite the downpour. "I know this must be quite a shock. It's been more years than I care to count since I last saw my sister." Eli shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at Grace. She was starting to fuss in her stroller, tiny hands reaching up as raindrops speckled the clear plastic cover. "I'm sorry," he managed, "but I really need to get her home before she catches cold." Of course. Walter nodded, but didn't move away, his clear blue eyes fixed on Grace with wonder. "She looks just like Lydia did as a baby. Those same dark curls." His voice cracked slightly. "I have a picture at home. Must be nearly 60 years old now." A car splashed by, sending a wave of water onto the curb. Eli instinctively pulled the stroller back, checking to make sure Grace stayed dry. The motion seemed to snap him out of his daze. "Look, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't mean any disrespect, but this isn't, I can't." He broke off, unable to find the right words. How could he explain the shame churning in his gut? The desperation that had driven him to pawn his dead wife's ring? Walter's expression softened with understanding. "You don't owe me any explanations, son, but please." He reached into his coat pocket with slightly trembling hands and pulled out a small business card. "Take this. It's got my home number and address. When you're ready to talk, I'd love to hear about her, about both of you." Eli stared at the card, making no move to take it. The rain was coming down harder now, pattering against Grace's stroller cover like tiny drums. She let out a whimper, and Eli's protective instincts kicked in. "I appreciate the offer," he said stiffly, "but we need to go." He started to turn the stroller away. "Wait," Walter called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency that made Eli pause. "Please, just one more moment." The old man fumbled with his wallet, pulling out several worn bills. "Let me at least give you something for—" "No." Eli's voice came out sharper than he intended. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," Walter said quietly. "It's family." The word hit Eli like a physical blow. Family. He hadn't had any since Lydia died, just him and Grace against the world. The thought of someone else claiming that connection, especially a stranger. "You don't know us," he said, his voice rough. "Just because you knew Lydia once?" "She was my baby sister," Walter interrupted, his eyes suddenly bright with tears. "She left home at 18, and I've regretted every day since that I didn't try harder to understand her choices, to support her. Please don't let my mistakes keep us apart now." Grace chose that moment to let out a full-throated cry, her patience with the rain and strange situation finally exhausted. Eli automatically reached down to adjust her blanket, his callous mechanic's hands gentle as he tucked it more securely around her. Walter watched the tender gesture with a sad smile. "You're a good father," he said softly. "I can see that plain as day. Lydia must have chosen well." Something in Eli's chest tightened at those words. He'd been doubting himself so much lately, struggling to make ends meet, feeling like he was failing Grace at every turn. To have this stranger, this man who claimed to be family, see something worth praising. The rain continued to fall, but neither man moved. Finally, Walter held out the business card again. "Take it," he said. "No pressure, no expectations, just possibility." Eli hesitated for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took the card. The paper was slightly damp from the rain, but the blue ink was still clear. Walter Dempsey, followed by an address and phone number. "Thank you," Eli said quietly, tucking the card into his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what else to say. Walter seemed to understand. He nodded, leaning heavily on his cane. "You take care of that precious girl," he said. "And yourself too. Lydia would want that." The mention of her name still hurt, but somehow less sharply than before. Eli managed a small nod before turning the stroller around and heading down the wet sidewalk toward home. He could feel Walter's gaze on his back as he walked away, but he didn't look back. His mind was too full of questions, memories, and the weight of the business card in his pocket. Grace had settled down to quiet sniffles, soothed by the motion of the stroller. The rain began to ease as they made their way through the familiar streets of their small Kentucky town. By the time they reached their apartment building, it had faded to a gentle mist. Eli paused under the rusty awning, looking down at his daughter's peaceful face. She had dozed off, one tiny hand clutched around the edge of her blanket. "What do you think, Gracie?" he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "Should we give your great-uncle a chance?" She slept on, offering no answer. But as Eli reached into his pocket and felt the damp edge of Walter's card, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, something that might change everything. The streetlight cast irregular shadows on the wet pavement as Eli and Walter stood facing each other, the space between them heavy with unspoken questions and decades of lost time. Grace's soft whimpers filled the awkward silence, her tiny voice cutting through the steady patter of rain on the awning above them. Walter leaned heavily on his wooden cane, the polished oak worn smooth by years of faithful use. His weathered face, mapped with lines that spoke of both sorrow and joy, was etched with a mix of hope and hesitation that made Eli's chest tighten with recognition. "Lydia, she left home when she was 18, Walter said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain drumming against the shop's metal roof. Each word seemed to cost him something precious. It was Christmas Eve, 1985. The snow was falling so thick you couldn't see past the front porch. We never heard from her again." Eli shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other, studying the old man's face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust too quickly. There was something in those clear blue eyes that reminded him so strongly of Lydia's, the same gentle determination that had carried her through her final months. The same spark of life that had made her seem invincible even when she wasn't. Still, years of struggling alone, of doors slammed in his face and promises broken, had taught him to be wary of strangers, even kind-looking ones who claimed impossible connections. "Sir, I appreciate what you're saying, but," Eli started, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper he couldn't name. "She loved to paint," Walter interrupted gently, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Little watercolors of birds and flowers. Cardinals and blue jays mostly. Daisies and black-eyed Susans. Used to cover our mama's old Frigidaire with them, dozens and dozens, held up with magnets shaped like strawberries." Eli's breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. In their tiny apartment, tucked away in the bottom drawer of Lydia's old dresser, a drawer he couldn't bear to open without feeling like he was drowning, lay dozens of her watercolors. Delicate studies of chickadees perched on winter branches, wildflowers dancing in imaginary breezes, each one signed with her careful script, L.T., for Lydia Turner, the name she'd chosen when she chose him. "She did," he admitted quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Right up until the end. Even when her hands shook, she kept painting, said the birds needed someone to remember their songs." Walter's grip tightened on his cane until his knuckles showed white against the worn wood. "The end?" Grace began to cry in earnest now, her tiny face scrunching up against the cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing Eli had wrapped around her. The sound cut through him like it always did, pure need, pure trust that he would somehow make everything right. He automatically reached down to adjust her blanket, his callous mechanic's hands, stained with motor oil and marked by countless small cuts, gentle as butterfly wings against her soft skin. "Cancer," Eli said, the word still bitter on his tongue after 8 months of practice. 8 months ago. It happened fast, too fast for treatments, too fast for goodbyes that felt like enough. He swallowed hard, fighting the familiar ache in his throat that threatened to choke him. She never talked much about her past, said some doors were better left closed, that looking backward only kept you from moving forward. A tear rolled down Walter's weathered cheek, catching the streetlight as it disappeared into his gray beard. His whole body seemed to shrink in on itself, as if the weight of all those lost years had suddenly become too much to bear. "Oh, Lydia," he whispered, her name a prayer and a lament all at once. "My stubborn little sister." He took a shaky breath that rattled in his chest. "But she found love? She was happy? Please tell me she was happy." Eli nodded, unable to speak for a long moment, as the memory of Lydia's laugh washed over him bright and fearless, even in her final days, ringing through hospital corridors like church bells on Sunday morning. She'd been so alive, even when death was stealing her away piece by piece. "She was," he finally managed. "She lit up every room she entered, made friends with every nurse, every doctor, even made the oncologist laugh when he told us." Eli's voice broke slightly. "She said dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. living without hope was. Walter closed his eyes, and for a moment Eli thought the old man might collapse right there on the sidewalk. But when he opened them again, there was something new there, a kind of peace mixed with determination. "Let me buy you both a hot meal," Walter said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "Please. I know a place just around the corner, Rosie's Diner. Best coffee in 3 counties, and private booths where the little one can rest properly. No strings attached. Just let an old man do something for his sister's family." Eli's pride warred with his empty stomach and the cold that was seeping through his thin jacket like water through a broken dam. Grace's cry turned into a hungry wail that made his heart clench with familiar guilt, making the decision for him with the brutal clarity that only a parent could understand. "Just for a little while," he conceded, already knowing he was crossing a line he'd sworn not to cross again. The bell above Rosie's door chimed as they entered, a cheerful brass sound that seemed to announce their arrival to the warm, bright world inside. The contrast hit Eli like a physical force, the warm air heavy with the smell of fresh coffee and home-baked pie, the soft yellow light that made everything look golden and safe. It had been so long since he'd been somewhere that felt like sanctuary. The waitress, a motherly woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and laugh lines that spoke of a lifetime of kindness, looked up from wiping down the counter and broke into a genuine smile. "Walter Dempsey!" she called out, her voice carrying the warmth of old friendship. "Your usual spot's open, honey, and I see you've brought company." They settled into a worn red vinyl booth near the back, the kind that had probably hosted 1,000 conversations and absorbed 1,000 secrets. Grace finally quieted as Eli gave her a bottle, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb with the absolute trust that still amazed him every single day. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant bees, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clinked together in a rhythm that spoke of home and normalcy. Walter ordered coffee and 2 generous slices of apple pie without consulting the menu, clearly a regular who knew exactly what comfort looked like in this place. "Tell me about her," Walter said softly, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like it was an anchor. "Please. All these years, I've imagined so many different lives for her. I need to know." So Eli did. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, but then faster as Walter's patient attention drew them out. He told Walter about meeting Lydia at the public library where she worked part-time, cataloging returned books with the same careful attention she gave to her paintings, about her collection of paint-splattered coffee mugs, each one a different color and each one telling a story, about how she sang old hymns while she cooked Sunday dinner, her voice clear and sweet as she moved around their tiny kitchen like she was dancing. With each story, each shared memory offered up like a small gift. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. It felt good to speak her name aloud, to let someone else carry the weight of missing her, even if only for a few minutes. Walter listened with the intensity of a man drinking water after crossing a desert, occasionally wiping his eyes with a pressed white handkerchief that he pulled from his coat pocket. He shared his own memories in return. Lydia at 5 years old, small and fierce, determined to rescue every stray cat in their neighborhood and nurse them back to health in cardboard boxes under her bed. Lydia at 16, sneaking extra pieces of her grandmother's famous pound cake to the church choir practice because she couldn't stand the thought of anyone going home hungry. She kept her faith, Walter said finally, his voice thick with emotion and something that might have been wonder. Even after everything that happened, even after the way I failed her, she kept believing? Eli nodded, remembering Lydia's hands folded in prayer even when the IV lines made them clumsy, remembering her voice raised in hymns even when the cancer made it weak. Till the very end, said grace over every meal, even in the hospital when all she could manage was ice chips. He looked down at his half-eaten pie, the sweet filling suddenly too much. "I haven't been able to pray since she died. Can't find the words anymore." Walter reached across the table, his aged hand resting briefly on Eli's arm, with a touch that was somehow both gentle and sure. The skin was thin as paper but warm, and for just a moment, Eli felt less alone than he had in months. "The Lord understands, son," Walter said quietly. "Grief has its own timeline, its own language. Sometimes silence is its own kind of prayer." Grace needed changing, and Eli excused himself to the restroom, navigating the narrow hallway with practiced ease. When he returned a few minutes later, Grace clean and content against his shoulder, the booth was empty except for a small white envelope propped against his coffee cup like a question mark. His heart began to pound as he looked around the diner, searching for any sign of Walter's gray coat or wooden cane. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope to find two crisp $100 bills and a handwritten note in careful script. For Grace, family helps family. Some angels wear work boots and carry babies. Your Lydia would be proud. W.D. Looking around the diner with growing amazement, he caught no sight of Walter anywhere. The motherly waitress was humming softly as she refilled sugar dispensers, and a young couple shared pie in a corner booth, but Walter had vanished as quietly as he had appeared. Outside, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink and blue shadows across Grace's peaceful face as she dozed against his shoulder. Maybe angels really do wear old coats and use canes, he whispered to her, touching the envelope with fingers that shook with something that might have been hope. And maybe they know exactly when to disappear before you can say thank you. The morning sun filtered through threadbare curtains, casting thin strips of light across Eli's worn carpet. The golden rays highlighted every faded spot and frayed edge in the small apartment, making the shabbiness more pronounced in the gentle illumination. He'd barely slept, his mind caught in an endless loop of yesterday's encounter at the pawn shop. The old man's words, "That was my sister's ring," had echoed through his restless hours like a prayer he couldn't quite understand. Grace had been up twice in the night, fussing with what he hoped was just teething, and now she dozed peacefully in her second-hand crib, tiny fingers curled around the soft yellow blanket that Lydia had sewn during those last precious weeks. A soft knock at the door made Eli freeze mid-step as he reached for his coffee mug. The sound was gentle, almost apologetic, nothing like the aggressive pounding of bill collectors or the impatient rap of his landlord. He glanced at the clock on the microwave, 8:17 a.m., too early for anyone with bad news, too late for emergencies. Still, his heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door, his sock-covered feet silent on the thin carpet that had seen better decades. Through the peephole, he saw Walter Dempsey's lined face, patient and kind, weathered by years but softened by an unmistakable gentleness. The old man stood with perfect posture despite his age, holding something carefully in his weathered hands, though Eli couldn't make out what it was from this angle. A small velvet box, perhaps, or an envelope. For a moment, he considered pretending he wasn't home, simply staying frozen behind the door until Walter gave up and left. The shame of yesterday still burned hot in his chest, the memory of standing at that pawn shop counter, fighting back tears as he handed over the last piece of his wife he had left. But Grace chose that moment to let out a happy morning gurgle, her voice carrying clear as a bell through the thin apartment walls. Eli's shoulders slumped in resignation, and he reached for the deadbolt with fingers that trembled slightly. He opened the door slowly, suddenly conscious of his wrinkled t-shirt that he'd slept in, the stubble covering his jaw, and the apartment's sparse furnishings visible behind him. The place looked exactly like what it was, the home of a man barely keeping his head above water. "Mr. Dempsey," he said, his voice rough with sleep and embarrassment. "I wasn't expecting. Please, call me Walter." The old man's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth, the kind that seemed to reach right into the corners of Eli's defended heart. In his weathered hands, spotted with age but steady as stone, he held a familiar velvet box, the same one Eli had watched disappear behind the pawn shop counter just yesterday. "May I come in? I have something that belongs to you." Eli stepped back automatically, his bare feet finding a small toy truck that clattered across the linoleum. He bent to retrieve it, gesturing awkwardly toward the small living room with its mismatched furniture and hand-me-down decorations. "It's not much," he mumbled, quickly gathering a few stray baby toys from the couch blocks and plastic rings that Grace had scattered during yesterday's playtime. He stacked them hastily on the coffee table, trying to create some semblance of order in the chaos of single parenthood. Walter eased himself onto the cleared space, his movements careful and deliberate, like a man who'd learned to respect his body's limitations. He placed the velvet box on the coffee table between them, with the reverence usually reserved for sacred things. The worn fabric caught the morning light, and Eli felt his breath catch in his throat. "You shouldn't have had to give this up," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of deep conviction. "Lydia wouldn't forgive me if I didn't bring it back to where it belongs." Eli's throat tightened, the familiar burn of unshed tears threatening behind his eyes. "I can't accept that," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The money you spent, I know how much they were asking. That's money you need, sir. I can't let you—" "Money's just paper," Walter interrupted gently, his weathered hands folding over the box like a protective shield. "Numbers on a bank statement. But this?" He gestured toward the box with something approaching reverence. "This is memory made solid. This is love that refuses to die." He opened the box with practiced care, and Lydia's ring caught the morning light like a small star fallen to earth. Its modest diamond threw sparkles across the wall, tiny rainbows that danced in the dust motes floating through the sunbeam. Did she ever tell you how she picked this particular ring? Eli shook his head slowly, sinking into the threadbare armchair across from Walter. The chair had been Lydia's favorite spot for reading, and he could almost feel her presence settling around him like a warm embrace. She just said it felt right the moment she saw it, he said softly. We didn't have much money for anything fancy, but she said the expensive ones felt cold. This one felt like home. That's Lydia all over. Walter's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years from his features even as his eyes grew distant with memory. Always knew her mind instantly about everything that truly mattered. My Margaret, my wife, she was exactly the same way. Could walk into a room full of choices and pick the right one without a moment's hesitation. Said her heart did the choosing before her head even got involved. Grace's happy babbling drew their attention away from the heavy conversation. She'd awakened fully now, standing in her crib with her hands gripping the rail, bouncing slightly on her chubby legs as she reached toward them with grabby, insistent hands. Her fine blonde hair stuck up in impossible directions, and her face was flush pink from sleep. Eli rose immediately to get her, grateful for the momentary distraction from emotions too big for the small room. Would you like some coffee? He asked, settling Grace on his hip, where she immediately began patting his chest with her tiny palms. She was getting heavier every day, a solid warmth against his side that reminded him daily of how much she was growing, how much she needed, how desperately he wanted to provide it all. It's just instant, nothing fancy, but instant's perfect, Walter assured him with the kind of smile that made Eli feel like his simple offerings were somehow enough. Been drinking it since Korea. Makes everything else taste like heaven by comparison. Funny how a man can get used to just about anything when he has to. In the tiny kitchen, Eli carefully, one-handedly measured coffee crystals into 2 mismatched mugs, one bearing a faded Christmas scene of Santa's sleigh that Lydia had bought at a thrift store, the other advertising a long-closed auto shop where he'd briefly worked. Grace helped by trying to grab everything within reach, her tiny fingers surprisingly strong and determined. The kettle's whistle seemed too loud in the morning, quiet, piercing through the comfortable silence that had settled between the two men. When he returned to the living room, balancing the mugs carefully, while Grace squirmed in his other arm, Walter had taken out his wallet and was showing Grace a worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. That's your Aunt Margaret, he told her in the gentle voice people reserve for babies and wounded things. She would have loved you something fierce, little one. Would have spoiled you rotten with homemade cookies and bedtime stories. Eli set the mugs down carefully on coasters made from old magazines, then lowered himself back into his chair. Grace immediately squirmed to get down, her newly mobile determination stronger than his tired arms could contain. She toddled unsteadily toward a pile of colorful blocks in the corner, her diaper crinkling with each wobbly step. She's got her mother's determination, Walter observed with obvious delight, taking a careful sip from the Christmas mug. The coffee was too hot, but he didn't seem to mind. Margaret was exactly like that with our boys when they were small, never still for a moment, always reaching for something new, always convinced the next thing would be even better than what they had. Boys? Eli asked, suddenly realizing how little he actually knew about this man who claimed to be family. Lydia had never spoken of brothers, of any family at all, really. Her past had always seemed to begin the day she'd arrived in their small Kentucky town, as if she'd been born fully formed at 18 with nothing but dreams and determination. Walter nodded slowly, his weathered hands warming around the mug. 2 sons. David's a pastor now, got his own church up in Louisville. Built quite a congregation from what I hear. Good man, though he carries too much weight on his shoulders sometimes. His voice caught slightly, the words becoming more careful. James, we lost him in Desert Storm. 22 years old and convinced he could save the world single-handed. The silence that followed felt heavy with shared understanding, the kind that only exists between men who've learned that life takes more than it gives. Eli found himself reaching for the cardboard box he kept under the coffee table, the one filled with photographs and memories he couldn't quite bear to display but couldn't bring himself to pack away. Would you like to see some pictures of Lydia and Grace? Walter's face lit up like Christmas morning, years falling away from his features in an instant. More than anything in this world, son. They spent the next 2 hours going through photographs with the careful reverence of archaeologists uncovering ancient treasures. Their coffee grew cold and forgotten as Eli shared the visual story of the life Walter had missed. Pictures of Lydia in the tiny garden she'd coaxed to life behind their apartment, her hands dark with soil and her face bright with satisfaction. Photos of her painting Grace's nursery while 8 months pregnant, balanced precariously on a step stool, despite Eli's worried protests, her brushstrokes confident and sure. Images from her last Christmas, thin from the treatments but glowing as she held newborn Grace. Her eyes fierce with protective love and quiet determination to make every moment count. Walter touched each photograph gently, as if they might crumble under too much pressure. His fingers traced the edges with infinite care while he asked questions about each image, what Lydia had been thinking in that moment, what she'd said, how she'd laugh. He drank in every detail like a man dying of thirst, storing up memories of the sister he'd lost not once but twice. In return, he shared stories that painted young Lydia in colors Eli had never imagined. How she taught herself piano by ear, sitting for hours at their grandmother's old upright until she could play hymns that made the whole church weep. How she'd rescue injured birds and nurse them back to health in shoeboxes lined with soft cloth, releasing them with whispered blessings when they were strong enough to fly. How she'd always stood up for what she believed in, even as a child, facing down bullies twice her size and never backing down from what was right. That fierce spirit of hers, that's what drove her away from us in the end, Walter admitted, his voice heavy with decades of regret. Our father was a hard man, set in his ways like concrete, believed there was only one right way to live, and that was his way. And Lydia, she had dreams bigger than our small town could hold. Visions that stretched beyond what any of us could understand. The morning light had shifted to the warm gold of afternoon when Walter finally stood to leave, his movement slower now, as if the sharing of memories had taken something vital from him. He moved carefully to Grace's corner, where she was still contentedly playing with her blocks, building towers only to knock them down with delighted squeals. Bending down with visible effort, he reached out and patted her downy head with infinite gentleness. "She's got her mama's eyes," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That same spark, that same light that refuses to be dimmed." Eli smiled faintly, the ring box warm and solid in his palm like a promise cap. For the first time since Lydia's death, the weight of her memory felt less like a burden pulling him down and more like a blessing lifting him up, connecting him to something larger than his own grief and fear. 2 days later, Eli's old pickup truck rattled down the gravel path leading to Walter's farmhouse. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn, and Grace cooed softly from her car seat, clutching her favorite worn teddy bear. Eli glanced at the navy blue scarf on the passenger seat. Walter had left it at their last meeting, and it seemed as good an excuse as any to check on the old man. The farmhouse stood quietly against the Kentucky sky, its white paint peeling in long strips like old wallpaper. A rustic wraparound porch sagged at one corner, and several fence posts lay tilted at awkward angles. Eli's mechanic's eye caught every repair needed, every board that begged for attention. He parked beside Walter's weather-beaten Chevy and carefully lifted Grace from her seat. The wooden steps creaked under his feet as he approached the screen door, scarf in one hand, baby in the other. "Well, if it isn't the Turners." Walter's warm voice carried from inside before Eli could knock. The old man appeared, his blue eyes twinkling. "I was just pulling some biscuits from the oven. Perfect timing." "Found your scarf, Mr. Dempsey," Eli said, holding it out. "Walter, please." He waved them inside. "And those biscuits need butter and company to be proper biscuits." The kitchen smelled of fresh-baked bread and coffee. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Walter moved slowly but deliberately, pulling out a chair for Eli and grabbing a clean mason jar for water. "Sir," Eli began, settling Grace on his lap, "I couldn't help but notice your porch railing's loose. I could take a look at it for you." Walter paused, coffee pot hovering over 2 mismatched mugs. "Now, don't feel obligated. It's what I do. Or used to do, anyway." Eli bounced Grace gently as she reached for a biscuit. "Before the garage closed, might as well put these hands to use." Walter studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Tell you what, you fix what you can, and I'll feed you lunch. Deal?" "Deal." They settled into an easy rhythm. Walter held Grace, telling stories while Eli worked on the porch railing with tools from Walter's shed. The spring breeze carried the scent of wild honeysuckle as Walter's voice painted pictures of the past. Lydia was always singing, Walter remembered, rocking slightly in his chair. Even when Mama told her to hush, that voice would bubble up like a spring. Couldn't help herself. He chuckled. Stubborn as a mule, too. Once she set her mind to something, heaven help anyone who tried to stop her. Eli smiled, hammering a nail into place. That never changed. First time I met her, she marched right up to my garage and demanded I fix her car that minute. Didn't matter that we were closing, did you? Course I did. Couldn't say no to those eyes. They shared a knowing laugh, and Grace joined in with her baby giggles, not understanding but feeling the joy around her. Eli moved on to fix a broken window latch, then the squeaky screen door. Each repair felt like mending something inside himself. During Grace's nap in her stroller, carefully positioned in the shade of the porch, Walter brought out old photo album. Eli's throat tightened at the sight of teenage Lydia, her dark hair and braids, that familiar determined set to her jaw. She wore that same expression when she told me she was keeping the garage open late, Eli said softly, touching the photo. Even after she got sick. Said people needed their cars fixed, cancer or no cancer. Walter's weathered hand covered Eli's for a moment. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to Grace's soft breathing and the distant call of meadowlarks. As the afternoon wore on, Eli found himself sharing more than he had in months. Stories of Lydia's laugh, her passion for fixing things, her endless optimism, even in her final days. Walter listened with tears in his eyes, adding his own memories of her childhood determination and fierce love of life. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in warm oranges and pinks. Eli gathered his tools, watching Grace wake from her second nap with a sleepy smile. The porch railing stood solid now, the screen door swung silently, and the window latched properly. Walter stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the kitchen light. You've got more of a future than you think, son, he said softly. Eli buckled Grace into her car seat, her tiny hands reaching for the steering wheel. As he drove home along the quiet country roads, he found himself smiling at her in the rearview mirror, her face glowing in the last rays of sunlight. For the first time since Lydia's passing, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter, like maybe he wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe he was beginning to live again. The phone rang early Sunday morning, startling Eli as he warmed Grace's bottle. The baby squirmed in her high chair, tiny hands reaching for her breakfast. He tucked the phone between his ear and shoulder, testing the formula's temperature on his wrist. Hello? Ellie? It's Walter. The old man's voice crackled through the line, warm and hopeful. I was wondering if you and Grace might join me for church this morning. Oak Ridge Baptist, just off Main Street. Eli's hand stilled on the bottle. The last time he'd stepped into a church was for Lydia's funeral. The memory of flower arrangements and sympathetic whispers made his throat tight. He started, watching Grace's impatient wiggling. Walter, I haven't been to church since. I know, son, Walter said gently. But sometimes the hardest steps are the ones worth taking. No pressure, just thought you might like the company. Eli looked at the wall calendar where Lydia used to mark important dates. She'd always circled Sundays in red ink. What time? He heard himself ask. Service starts at 10. I'll save you both a seat. An hour later, Eli parked his truck in the crowded church lot. Grace wore her cleanest yellow dress, her wispy hair secured with tiny clips. He'd managed to find a decent button-down shirt that wasn't too wrinkled, though his work boots were the best he could do for shoes. The white clapboard church stood tall against the morning sky, its steeple reaching towards scattered clouds. People in their Sunday best filtered through the heavy wooden doors, some turning to stare as Eli lifted Grace from her car seat. Walter waited on the steps, leaning on his cane but smiling broadly. There's my girl, he called, reaching to touch Grace's cheek as they approached. She grabbed his finger, giggling. And looking like a princess today. Inside, the familiar smell of old hymnals and wood polish brought memories flooding back. Lydia, standing beside him in the choir. Lydia, teaching Sunday school. Lydia, praying with such quiet certainty while he struggled to find the words. Walter led them to a pew near the front, helping Eli settle Grace with her soft toys. The whispers followed them down the aisle. He could feel dozens of eyes on his back, could almost hear the questions. Who was this rough-looking young man? Why was Walter Dempsey, a respected church elder, fussing over him? As the organ music began, a tall man in pastoral robes approached their pew. His silver hair and blue eyes echoed Walter's, though his face held none of the old man's gentleness. Dad, the pastor said, nodding to Walter, won't you introduce me to your guests? Walter brightened. David, this is Eli Turner and his daughter Grace. Eli was married to Lydia. The pastor's welcoming smile froze, then disappeared entirely. His eyes hardened like blue steel. Lydia? He repeated, voice sharp enough to make Grace look up from her toys. My aunt who abandoned her family for sin? The words fell like stones in the quiet church. Eli's face burned as heads turned, conversations stopping mid-sentence. He'd seen that look before. Judgment masked as righteousness, condemnation wrapped in concern. David. Walter's voice carried unexpected steel. He pushed himself to his feet, one hand gripping his cane tight. You will not speak of your aunt that way. Not here. Not ever. Dad, you can't seriously? Lydia was 18 when she left, Walter continued, loud enough for nearby pews to hear clearly. She left because our father's idea of faith was control, not love. Because we watched her spirit die a little more each day, under his rules and his judgment. She chose freedom. And yes, it broke our hearts. But the sin wasn't hers. The silence in the church grew heavy. David's face had gone pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Eli wanted to sink through the floor, to grab Grace and run, but Walter's hand found his shoulder, steady and warm. She found love, the old man said softly. She found faith again, on her own terms. And she raised a daughter who gave me this beautiful great niece. God's grace works in mysterious ways, son, even through the paths we don't understand. Eli stood carefully, lifting Grace into his arm. She buried her face in his neck, sensing the tension. Thank you, Walter, he managed, voice rough, for everything. But we should go. Eli, wait, Walter began. But Eli was already moving down the aisle, head high, despite the whispers, despite the shame burning in his chest. He wouldn't let them see him break. Not here, not now. The morning air felt cool on his face as he strapped Grace into her car seat. She watched him with Lydia's eyes, serious and knowing beyond her years. His hand shook slightly as he started the truck. Hours later, long after Grace had gone to sleep in her crib, Eli sat in the darkness of their small apartment. The only light came from her nightlight, casting star-shaped shadows on the wall. He watched her tiny chest rise and fall, remembering how Lydia used to do the same thing. I thought I was done being judged, he whispered into the quiet room. But Grace slept on peacefully, unaware of the weight her father carried, of the way the past reached forward with sharp fingers to wound the present. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eli's front porch as he opened his door. Grace balanced on his hip. He nearly stumbled over the neat stack of grocery bags blocking his path. His eyes widened as he took in the sight: fresh milk, bread, baby formula, and even the exact brand of diapers Grace wore. A folded note sat atop the packages, the handwriting shaky but clear. From one dad to another, W. Eli's throat tightened. He gathered the bags one by one, bringing them into his small kitchen while Grace watched from her playpen. The generosity overwhelmed him, not just the items themselves, but the thoughtfulness behind each choice. Walter had paid attention to every detail during their visits. After putting away the groceries, Eli strapped Grace into her car seat. Let's go thank Grandpa Walter, sweetheart. The word grandpa slipped out naturally, surprising him. He hadn't meant to say it, but somehow it felt right. The drive to Walter's farmhouse took them past autumn-touched fields. Grace babbled happily in the back seat, and Eli found himself humming something he hadn't done since Lydia passed. Walter's old Chevy truck sat in the gravel driveway, hood up, tools scattered around it. The elderly man stood there, one hand on the fender for support, peering down at the engine with a frustrated expression. Need a hand? Eli called out, lifting Grace from her car seat. Walter's face brightened. Just the man I was hoping to see. He gestured at the truck. Old girl won't start. Been meaning to get her fixed, but he tapped his cane against the ground. These legs aren't what they used to be. Eli settled Grace on a blanket in the shade with her toys and rolled up his sleeves. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal brought back memories of his mechanic days. Mind if I take a look? Please do. Can't drive her anymore myself, but I hate seeing her sit here rusting. As Eli leaned over the engine, Walter pulled up a lawn chair nearby. The old man watched with interest, occasionally pointing out parts he recognized. Learned a bit about engines in Korea, he said, though they were simpler back then. You served? Eli asked, reaching for a wrench. 2 tours. Lost some good friends over there. Walter's voice grew distant. Lost my Margaret when I came home too. She waited for me, but the man who returned wasn't the same one who left. Eli paused his work, looking up. Walter rarely spoke about his late wife. She had patience, though, Walter continued, smiling softly. Taught me how to love again, how to trust in God's timing. Wrote me letters all through the war, saved every single one. They worked through the morning. Eli's hands steady on the tools, while Walter shared stories. He spoke about faith during wartime, about learning to forgive himself, about rediscovering joy in small moments. Around noon, they broke for lunch. Walter had packed sandwiches, and they sat in the shade watching Grace play with her blocks. "You know," Walter said carefully, "writing helped me after Margaret passed. Just letters, things I wished I could tell her." Eli tensed slightly. "Don't know if I'm ready for that." "Nobody's ever ready," Walter replied gently. "But sometimes the heart needs to speak, even if only on paper." They spent the afternoon finishing the truck repairs. By sunset, the engine purred smoothly. Eli wiped his hands on a rag, satisfaction warming his chest. It felt good to fix something again, to make something broken work. "Thank you for the groceries," Eli said as they packed up the tools. "You didn't have to do that. Family takes care of family," Walter answered simply. The drive home was quiet, Grace already asleep in her car seat. Eli's mind kept returning to Walter's words about writing letters. After tucking Grace into her crib, he found himself sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand, blank paper before him. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote the date at the top. The words came slowly at first. "Dear Lydia, today I met a man who remembers your laugh." The late afternoon sun bathed Walter's wraparound porch in golden light. Eli sat in a weathered rocking chair, watching as Walter played peekaboo with Grace. The old man's wrinkled hands would cover his face, then pop out with an exaggerated "oh" that made Grace squeal with delight every time. "She's got quite the laugh," Walter said, his blue eyes twinkling as Grace reached for his fingers. "Just like her mama." Eli nodded, sipping his coffee from a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Grandpa." The familiar ache in his chest felt different today, softer somehow, like an old bruise slowly healing. "Speaking of Lydia," Walter said, settling back in his chair with Grace on his knee, "how are those letters coming along?" Eli shifted, suddenly self-conscious. The folded paper in his pocket felt heavy. "I've written a few," he admitted. "They're not very good." Walter bounced Grace gently. "Good according to who? They're not for publishing, son. They're for healing." Eli pulled out the worn piece of paper, unfolding it carefully. The words were messy, written late at night, when Grace was finally asleep. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Walter said simply. His voice was gentle but firm. "Read it to us." Eli cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read. "Dear Lydia, today I changed the oil in Mr. Peterson's ancient Buick again. Remember how you used to tease me about that car? You said it was older than both of us combined, but still ran better than our first apartment's heating. I miss your jokes. I miss the way you'd bring me coffee at the shop, even though you hated the smell of motor oil. I miss how you'd scrunch your nose when Grace made a mess, then laugh and say she got that from my side of the family. Everyone says it gets easier with time. They're wrong. It doesn't get easier. It gets different. The pain changes shape. Some days it's sharp, like that first morning in the hospital. Other days it's dull, like an engine running rough, but still running. Grace has your eyes. Sometimes when she looks at me, I see you there, and it breaks my heart all over again. But then she smiles, and I remember what you told me the day she was born. Love is stronger than fear. I'm trying to be strong, Lydia. I'm trying to be the father she needs. But some days, I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. Some days, I can barely keep the lights on, let alone give her the life you dreamed of." Eli's voice cracked. He stopped, folding the paper quickly, but not before noticing the tears running down Walter's weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," Eli mumbled. "I shouldn't have." "Don't you dare apologize," Walter said, wiping his eyes with one hand while still holding Grace secure with the other. "That's the most honest prayer I've heard in years." "Prayer?" Eli shook his head. "It's just a letter." Walter leaned forward, his expression serious. "Son, faith isn't about fancy words or church walls. It's about love lived daily. It's about getting up every morning and choosing hope, even when hope feels foolish. Those letters, they're your conversations with love itself. And that's what God is, isn't it?" Grace reached up, patting Walter's damp cheek with her tiny hand. The old man smiled, catching her hand and kissing it softly. "You know," Walter said after a moment, "we're having a little community potluck next weekend. Nothing fancy, just good food and better company. You and Grace should come." Eli tensed. The memory of David's harsh words at church was still fresh. "I don't know." "No pressure," Walter assured him. "Just a few neighbors sharing a meal. Mrs. Henderson makes the best apple pie this side of Kentucky, and Tom Bradley grills chicken that would make angels weep." Grace chose that moment to giggle, reaching for Eli with grabby hands. He took her from Walter, settling her against his chest, where she immediately began playing with his shirt buttons. "Will David be there?" Eli asked quietly. Walter shook his head. "He's at a pastor's conference in Louisville that weekend." "But Eli, you can't let one man's bitterness keep you from living." "Lydia wouldn't want that." Eli watched as the sun began its slow descent over Walter's fields, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grace was getting heavy in his arms, her eyes drooping as she fought sleep. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll come." Walter's face lit up. "Wonderful. I'll even dig out my secret recipe for cornbread." They sat in comfortable silence as the day faded, watching the first stars appear. Grace had fallen asleep, her warm weight anchoring Eli to the moment. The evening air was sweet with the scent of late summer flowers, and somewhere in the distance, crickets began their nightly chorus. "You know something?" Eli said softly, almost to himself. "Maybe God hasn't forgotten me after all." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, with a gentle breeze rustling through the oak trees at Murphy Park. Golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows across the dewy grass. Eli Turner stood at his bathroom mirror, fumbling with his tie the first time he'd worn one since Lydia's funeral 18 months ago. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the knot, the silk feeling foreign against his calloused fingers. The reflection, staring back at him, looked older than his 34 years. Dark circles still shadowed his eyes, and his brown hair needed a trim. But there was something different today, a spark of hope he hadn't seen in months. Maybe it was Walter's gentle encouragement, or maybe it was finally time to step back into the world of the living. "What do you think, sweetheart?" he asked Grace, who sat in her portable playpen nearby, surrounded by colorful blocks. She responded with a happy gurgle, drooling on her fresh yellow sundress that Mrs. Henderson from next door had brought over yesterday. The soft cotton fabric brought out the golden flecks in Grace's hazel eyes, Lydia's eyes. "Yeah, I guess the tie is too much." He slipped it off and unbuttoned his collar, trying to look casual but presentable. This wasn't a job interview. It was supposed to be fun. He scooped Grace up, breathing in her sweet baby scent, a mixture of Johnson shampoo and innocence. "Ready to meet some new people, little one?" She grabbed at his nose with her tiny fist, making him smile despite his nerves. The park was already buzzing with activity when they arrived in Walter's borrowed pickup truck. Red checkered tablecloths fluttered on picnic tables scattered beneath the towering oaks, and the smell of fried chicken, fresh baked pies, and smoky barbecue filled the warm summer air. Families were setting up lawn chairs and coolers, children's laughter mixing with the gentle hum of conversation. Eli spotted Walter near the food tables, arranging paper plates with careful precision, his silver hair catching the morning light. "There's my favorite girl," Walter called out as Grace squealed in recognition, her whole face lighting up with pure joy. His weathered face crinkled with genuine delight as he held out his arms, his blue eyes sparkling. "And look at this fancy dress. You're prettier than a Sunday morning, little miss." Eli handed Grace over, along with a covered dish wrapped in one of Lydia's old kitchen towels, the one with tiny strawberries that he couldn't bear to throw away. "It's just mac and cheese, nothing special." "Nonsense," Walter said, peeking under the foil. The rich, cheesy aroma wafted up, golden and comforting. "Margaret's recipe?" "Lydia's, actually." Eli's voice softened, his throat tightening slightly. "She used to make it for church potlucks back in Louisville. Said the secret was using 3 different cheeses and a dash of mustard powder." Walter's expression grew tender. "She had good taste. This smells like heaven." More people arrived, filling the park with chatter and laughter. Families emerged from minivans and pickup trucks, children racing ahead with the boundless energy of youth, while parents juggled casserole dishes and diaper bags. Children chased each other through the grass, while parents set up lawn chairs in patches of shade, the familiar rhythm of community gatherings settling over the park like a warm blanket. Eli noticed a few curious glances his way, but they felt different from the usual pity, more welcoming somehow, as if people were actually seeing him rather than just his circumstances. A middle-aged man in a Cardinals baseball cap nodded in greeting. 2 women by the dessert table smiled warmly when Grace waved her chubby hands in their direction. Mrs. Thompson, who ran the local bakery and always smelled faintly of vanilla and cinnamon, approached with a warm smile that reached her kind brown eyes. "Walter tells me you're quite the mechanic," she said, effortlessly taking Grace from Walter's arms and bouncing her on her hip. Grace immediately reached for the woman's silver earrings, fascinated by their gentle swaying. "My son's car's been making the strangest noise. Sounds like a dying cat when he tries to start it in the mornings." Before long, Eli found himself deep in conversation about timing belts and transmission fluid, his hands moving as he explained the likely culprits. It felt good to talk shop again, to have something valuable to offer beyond his sad story. His confidence grew with each technical detail, remembering who he used to be before grief had stripped away so much of his identity. Other townspeople drifted over, drawn by Walter's infectious laughter as he told stories about his days in Korea. The old man had a gift for making everyone feel included, his stories weaving together the past and present with threads of humor and wisdom. The mess hall cook couldn't boil water without burning it, Walter was saying, his eyes twinkling with mischief. But he had the biggest heart you'd ever seen. Used to save the best portions for the youngest soldiers, the ones who were homesick and scared. Reminded me of my sister, actually. He caught Eli's eye, his expression growing more serious, always finding ways to help people, even when she had nothing herself. A hush fell over the group, the weight of unspoken history settling among them. Eli felt their attention shift to him, but for once, he didn't mind. The familiar urge to retreat didn't come. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the desire to share, to connect. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. Lydia was like that too, he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the attentive silence. When we first met, I was working double shifts at the garage, barely making ends meet. She'd bring me lunch every day, said she was just practicing her cooking. Took me weeks to realize she was making sure I ate. He smiled at the memory, warmth spreading through his chest. She'd pack these elaborate sandwiches with notes tucked inside, little jokes or Bible verses. I kept every single one. People nodded, some wiping away tears. Mrs. Thompson squeezed his arm gently, her touch maternal and comforting. She sounds wonderful, dear. She was, Eli agreed, his voice steady and sure. And she would have loved this, all of you being so kind to Grace and me. She always said that family wasn't just blood, but the people who chose to love you. From the corner of his eye, Eli noticed Pastor David standing at the edge of the gathering, his tall frame partly hidden behind the trunk of an old maple tree. The minister's face was unreadable, but he didn't look angry anymore, just thoughtful, maybe even sad. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd, and for a moment, something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The afternoon mellowed into evening like honey poured from a jar. Children sprawled on blankets, sticky with watermelon juice and ice cream, their earlier energy transformed into drowsy contentment. Parents chatted in lawn chairs while teenagers played volleyball nearby, their shouts and laughter creating a soundtrack of summer joy. Grace had fallen asleep in Walter's arms, her cheek pressed against his worn denim shirt, one tiny fist curled around his finger. Here, Mrs. Thompson said, pressing a paper plate into Eli's hands with motherly insistence. You haven't eaten a thing, and a man your size needs more than conversation to keep going. This is Margaret's famous peach cobbler. Walter's been bragging about it all day. Eli took a bite, and the sweet, cinnamon spice fruit melted on his tongue. Memories flooded back. Sunday, dinners at Lydia's aunt's house, family gatherings where food was love made tangible, the simple joy of sharing meals with people who cared. He hadn't realized how hungry he'd been for more than just food. He'd been starving for belonging, for the warm embrace of community that he'd forgotten existed. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges that reminded him of cotton candy at the county fair, people started packing up their dishes and folding their chairs. Several stopped to shake Eli's hand or pat his shoulder, their touches lingering with genuine warmth. They left him with invitations to church suppers and offers of playdates for Grace, their words creating a bridge back to the world he'd thought was lost forever. Walter appeared at his side, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to accommodate old bones and a tired heart. He gently transferred the sleeping baby back to her father's arms, Grace barely stirring in the transition. Walter clapped Eli on the shoulder, his blue eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like pride. You did good today, son. Real good. Eli smiled, feeling the weight of months of isolation finally beginning to lift from his shoulders like morning fog burned away by sunlight. Here, in this park where he'd once played as a child, something fundamental was shifting, like the first warm breeze after a long winter, promising that spring was finally coming. For the first time since Lydia's death, he felt truly accepted, not just as someone to pity, but as part of something larger than his grief. He belonged here, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build a future on. The evening air had cooled considerably as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Empty plates and satisfied smiles marked the end of a successful community potluck. Eli was helping pack up the folding chairs when Walter jingled his truck keys. Well, I reckon it's time to head home, Walter announced, his cane tapping against the asphalt as he made his way toward his old Chevy. Hold on, Eli called out, hurrying after him. Let me drive you back. Walter waved him off with a gentle but firm hand. Been driving this old girl for 40 years. Don't need a chauffeur just yet. Eli glanced at Grace, sound asleep in her carrier, then back at Walter. Something in his gut told him to insist, but he respected the older man's independence. He watched as Walter eased himself behind the wheel, the truck's door groaning in protest. The Chevy's engine turned over with a rattling cough. Walter gave a confident wave and pulled out onto Main Street, leaving Eli to follow in his own car. Grace secured in her car seat. They hadn't made it halfway to the farmhouse when Eli noticed Walter's truck slowing, its engine sputtering ominously. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust pipe as the vehicle lurched, then died completely, rolling to a stop on the shoulder of Old Mill Road. Eli pulled over immediately, grabbing a flashlight from his glove compartment. "Stay here, sweetheart," he whispered to Grace, leaving the car running for the air conditioning. He jogged to Walter's truck, where the older man sat looking more frustrated than worried. "Looks like the old girl's having one of her moods," Walter said with a sheepish smile. Eli popped the hood, waving away the steam that escaped. The engine ticked as it cooled, and he ran his experienced hands over various components. "Could be the fuel pump," he muttered. "Or maybe the timing belt finally gave out." "Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix," Walter suggested hopefully. Eli shook his head, suppressing a smile. "I've got my tow rope in the trunk. Let's get you both home, and I'll take a proper look." It took 20 minutes to secure the tow rope and carefully pull Walter's truck back to the farmhouse. The gravel driveway crunched under their tires as they arrived, crickets chirping their evening symphony. Eli carried Grace, still sleeping, into the house first. He made a small nest of blankets on Walter's worn couch, tucking her in securely before heading out to the garage. Walter had already turned on the fluorescent lights and was rummaging through an old toolbox. "You don't have to do this tonight," Walter said, but Eli was already rolling up his sleeves. "Can't leave you without wheels," Eli replied, grabbing a socket wrench. "Besides, I haven't had a good excuse to get grease under my nails in a while." They worked together in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by requests for tools or gentle teasing about Walter's vintage truck. The radio played softly in the background, an old country station that reminded Eli of working in his father's garage as a boy. Around 10 o'clock, Walter disappeared into the house, returning with 2 glasses of his famous homemade lemonade. "Taking a break isn't giving up," he said, holding out a glass to Eli. Eli wiped his hands on a shop rag and accepted the drink gratefully. They settled onto 2 mismatched lawn chairs just outside the garage door, the summer night wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. "You know," Walter said, looking up at the stars, "I haven't had anyone to tinker with since Margaret passed. She used to bring us lemonade too, though hers was sweeter than mine." Eli sipped his drink, letting the tart liquid refresh his throat. "Lydia couldn't make lemonade to save her life," he chuckled. "Always forgot the sugar completely. Said it was healthier that way." They both laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet farmland. "I'm getting tired more easily these days," Walter admitted after a while, his voice softer. "Doctor says it's just age, but—" He waved his hand dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." Eli studied the older man's profile in the dim light, noting the slight droop in his shoulders. "You should have said something about feeling tired. I wouldn't have let you drive." "Can't stop living just because the parts aren't working like they used to," Walter replied with a wink. "Truck or man." They returned to work, and just before midnight, the Chevy's engine turned over smoothly, purring like it hadn't in years. "There she is," Eli said proudly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Fuel pump was the culprit, just like I thought. Got a few more miles in her now." Walter beamed, patting the truck's hood affectionately. "Just needed the right touch, like most things in life." Eli gathered his tools, while Walter cleaned up the workspace, both men moving with the easy familiarity of friendship. Inside, Grace still slept peacefully on her makeshift bed, tiny fingers curled around her blanket. "I should get her home," Eli said, carefully lifting his daughter. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, nuzzling into his shoulder. Walter walked them to the door, leaning on his cane. "You're welcome here any time, day or night," he said. "Both of you," Eli nodded, touched by the simple sincerity in Walter's voice. "I know. Thank you, Walter, for everything." As Eli's taillights disappeared down the driveway, Walter stood on his porch, the night air cool against his face. He looked up at the stars, their light twinkling through the branches of the old oak tree. "Lydia," he whispered into the quiet night, Your boy's in good hands. Eli sat at his small kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow over scattered papers. Grace slept soundly in her crib nearby, her gentle breathing a rhythm to his thoughts. He picked up his pen, smoothing out a fresh sheet of paper. "Dear Lydia," he wrote, his handwriting steady now after days of practice. "You wouldn't believe who I met. Your brother Walter. He's everything you described in those rare moments you spoke of: home, kind eyes, gentle spirit. The way he tells stories reminds me of you." The words flowed easier these days. Each letter felt like clearing dust from an old photograph, revealing memories he'd been too afraid to face. Some mornings, he wrote about simple things: how Grace had learned to grab her toes, or how the morning light reminded him of their first apartment. Other times, his words dug deeper. "I miss the way you'd sing while doing dishes," one letter read. "Sometimes I catch myself humming your songs to Grace. Remember that old Johnny Cash tune you loved? I used to pretend it annoyed me, but now I'd give anything to hear it again." During his daily visits to Walter's farm, Eli would sometimes share these letters. They'd sit on the porch, iced tea sweating in their glasses, while he read aloud. Walter would listen intently, occasionally wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. "Dear Lydia," Eli read one afternoon, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Today I fixed the broken shelf in Grace's room, the one I'd been avoiding because you bought those little elephant bookends. I finally hung them up. They're perfect, just like you said they'd be. I'm learning that looking at things that remind me of you doesn't have to hurt anymore. Sometimes it even helps." Walter nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's good writing, son. Real good. Honest." "Just thoughts on paper," Eli shrugged, folding the letter carefully. "No, it's more than that." Walter leaned forward in his rocking chair. "You're speaking truth that others need to hear. Have you considered sharing one at church?" Eli laughed, but it came out nervous. "Me? In front of people? Why not? Plenty of folks struggling with loss, thinking they're alone in it. Your words might help them find their way." Eli tucked the letter into his pocket, considering. The idea both terrified and intrigued him. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Start with the truth," Walter said simply. "That's all anyone can ask." Later that evening, after putting Grace to bed, Eli found himself rereading his letters. Some were tear-stained, others filled with anger or confusion. But lately, hope had begun creeping into the words. He picked up his pen again. "Dear Lydia, I think I'm starting to understand what you always said about faith being like a garden. It needs daily tending. Some days you pull weeds of doubt, other days you plant seeds of hope. Walter's teaching me that, though he'd probably just say he's sharing what he knows. Remember how you used to tell me that God speaks through people? I'm beginning to see what you meant." The stack of letters grew taller as the days passed. Some mornings, Eli wrote about his fears, the unpaid bills, the loneliness of single parenthood. Other days, he celebrated small victories: Grace's first tooth, a good day at work, a moment of unexpected laughter with Walter. "Dear Lydia, today I didn't cry when I saw our wedding photo. Instead, I smiled, remembering how you couldn't stop laughing during our first dance. Progress comes in small steps, I guess." Walter says that's how healing works, not in giant leaps, but in tiny moments of choosing to move forward. Each letter became a bridge between his past and present, between grief and healing. He wrote about the community potluck, about Walter's kindness, about rediscovering pieces of himself he thought were lost forever. One particular evening, as Grace dozed in her playpen, Eli wrote, "Dear Lydia, I held your ring today, the one Walter saved. Remember how it always sat a little crooked on your finger? You never wanted to resize it, said it was perfect in its imperfection. I'm learning that healing is like that too, not perfect, but real, authentic. Walter says that's what matters most." The idea of sharing these letters at church still made his hands sweat, but he found himself mentally sorting through them, wondering which ones might resonate with others, which words might help someone else feel less alone. Standing in his bedroom that night, Eli pulled out an old photo of Lydia. It was his favorite, caught mid-laugh at the county fair, cotton candy in her hand, joy radiating from her face. He'd kept it in a drawer since her passing, too painful to look at daily. Now, he found himself reaching for a thumbtack. Carefully, he pinned the photo to the wall near his bed. The moonlight caught her smile, and for the first time in months, looking at it didn't feel like a punch to the gut. Instead, it felt right, like putting something back where it belonged. "I'm starting to find my way back," he whispered to her image, touching the corner of the photograph gently. The words felt true in a way they hadn't before, not a promise or a hope, but a simple statement of fact. Like the letters scattered across his kitchen table, like Walter's steady presence, like Grace's morning smiles. It was another small step forward, another seed planted in the garden of his healing. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through Walter's kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams. Eli knelt in front of the old oak cabinet beneath the sink, his toolbox open beside him. The worn wood creaked as he carefully adjusted the loose hinges. "Hand me that Phillips head, would you?" Eli asked, reaching back without looking. Walter shuffled forward from his perch at the kitchen table, passing the screwdriver. "You know, son, you don't have to spend your Sunday morning fixing my cabinets." "I want to," Eli replied, tightening the final screw. "Besides, Grace loves visiting her great-uncle Walter." He nodded toward the living room where his daughter played contentedly in her portable playpen. The sharp rap of knuckles on the screen door cut through their easy conversation. Pastor David stood on the porch, his church suit crisp despite the humid morning. His expression tightened when he spotted Eli. "Dad," David called through the mesh, "I thought I'd stop by before second service." His eyes narrowed at the tools scattered across the kitchen floor. "I didn't realize you had company." Walter waved his son inside. Come in. Eli's just helping with some repairs." David stepped into the kitchen, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum. The comfortable atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a heavy tension. Eli busied himself gathering his tools, trying to make himself invisible. "Actually, Dad," David said, his voice measured and cool, "I was hoping to speak with you privately." Walter's weathered face hardened slightly. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Eli." David's jaw tightened. "Fine." He turned to face his father directly, pointedly ignoring Eli. "I'm concerned about how much time you're spending with certain people and how much money you're giving away." "David," Walter warned, but his son pressed on. "Mrs. Henderson from church saw you at the grocery store, buying formula and diapers, and now I find him here, worming his way into your good graces?" David's voice rose. "He's using you, Dad. Can't you see that? Playing on your guilt about Aunt Lydia to get handouts and sympathy." Eli's hands froze over his toolbox, his face burning. The screwdriver he'd been holding clattered to the floor. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd never asked for anything, but shame locked his throat. "That's enough." Walter's voice cut through the kitchen like steel. He pushed himself up from his chair, standing as straight as his aging frame would allow. "You don't know the first thing about Eli, or what kind of man he is." "I know his type," David insisted. "Lost souls who prey on kind-hearted people." "That boy," Walter interrupted, his voice trembling with anger, "has shown more genuine care for me in the past few weeks than you have in months. When was the last time you stopped by just to talk? To help with the house? To ask about my health?" He shook his head sadly. "Eli's more family than you've been lately." David recoiled as if slapped. "Dad!" "No." Walter held up a hand. "You come into my house, on the Lord's Day no less, to cast judgment on a good man who's done nothing but help me? Your mother would be ashamed." The silence that followed was deafening. Eli quietly closed his toolbox, his movements mechanical. He couldn't bear to look at either man. "I should go," he murmured, stepping around David. "Grace needs her nap anyway." He moved to the living room, scooping up his daughter and her toys with practiced ease. "Eli, you don't have to," Walter started. "It's okay." Eli managed a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for the coffee." He carried Grace to his car, securing her in her car seat, while father and son's raised voices drifted through the screen door. The morning sun felt too bright now, harsh and exposing. Eli leaned against his car door, eyes burning with unshed tears. "I'll prove them both wrong," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the chirping birds and distant church bells. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eli's apartment complex when 3 solid knocks echoed through his small living room. Grace was napping in her crib, and Eli had been trying to fix a stubborn coffee maker that kept shorting out. He wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door to find Walter standing there, looking particularly excited despite his usual careful movements. "Got a minute?" Walter asked, his blue eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. He was holding what looked like a folder full of papers. "Sure, come in," Eli said, moving aside. "Watch the coffee maker parts on the floor. I was just trying to—" "Always fixing something, aren't you?" Walter chuckled, carefully navigating around the scattered components. He lowered himself into the worn armchair by the window, the one Lydia used to love. "But that's exactly why I'm here. You've got a gift for fixing things, son, not just machines." Eli sat on the edge of the couch, curious. "What do you mean?" Walter pulled out several papers from his folder. "I've been thinking. There are lots of folks in town struggling like you were, single parents, trying to make ends meet. What if we hosted a community night? Raise some funds? Bring people together? Eli's stomach tightened. I don't know, Walter. After what happened with David at church? Forget David, Walter said firmly. This isn't about him. It's about doing something good. Besides, he added with a gentle smile, you're not alone anymore. We'll do it together. Eli glanced toward Grace's room, where soft baby breaths could be heard through the monitor. He thought about the groceries that had appeared on his porch, the ring Walter had rescued, the countless acts of kindness that had lifted him from despair. What exactly did you have in mind? He asked finally. Walter's face lit up. Nothing fancy. Just a simple gathering at the community center. Some food, maybe some music. You could share one of those letters you've been writing. Walter, just hear me out, the older man continued. Your words touch people, Eli. They need to hear stories like yours. And while we're at it, he pulled out some craft supplies from his bag. We can make some decorations ourselves. Save money. Eli couldn't help but laugh at the sight of Walter, an 82-year-old veteran, holding sheets of colored paper and markers. You're serious about this? As serious as a heart attack? Walter grinned. Which, at my age, is pretty serious. For the next hour, they spread materials across Eli's small kitchen table. Walter showed him how to fold paper banners, a skill he'd learned decades ago in his church youth group. Eli's first attempts were clumsy, but Walter's patient instructions helped him improve. The trick is in the corners, Walter demonstrated, his weathered hands moving with surprising precision. See how it creates a nice clean edge? Grace woke up during their craft session, and Walter entertained her while Eli worked on the banners. The baby giggled as Walter made silly faces, his dignity completely forgotten in the joy of making his grandniece laugh. I've got something else to show you, Eli said after a while. He went to his bedroom and returned with a folded piece of paper. I wrote this last night. Maybe it could work for the community night. Walter adjusted his glasses and listened intently as Eli read. Dear Lydia, today I fixed Mrs. Henderson's car. Remember how you always said we should help others even when we're hurting? I didn't understand then, but now I see how helping others helps heal our own hearts too. Grace watched me work, just like you used to. Sometimes when I'm under a car, I imagine you're still sitting there in your lawn chair, reading your book, keeping me company. Eli's voice cracked slightly. Walter reached across the table and squeezed his arm. That's perfect, Walter said softly. That's exactly what people need to hear. They worked through the afternoon, planning and preparing. Walter shared stories about community events he'd helped organize years ago, and Eli found himself taking notes, actually getting excited about the possibility of helping others who were struggling like he had been. As the day wore on, they attempted to make coffee using Eli's newly repaired coffee maker. The result was a disaster. Bitter, burnt coffee that filled the apartment with smoke. I thought you fixed it, Walter coughed, waving away the smoke. I thought I did too, Eli laughed, opening windows. Maybe I should stick to cars. They were still laughing when Eli knocked over a cup of paint water, sending it cascading across their carefully made banners. Instead of getting upset, Walter just grabbed paper towels and started blotting the mess. You know what? He said, grinning. The smudges give it character. Like us, a little rough around the edges, but still standing. Eli looked at their handiwork spread across the table. Slightly wrinkled banners. Some with water stains, others with crooked letters, but all made with care and purpose. He thought about how different his life was from just a few weeks ago, when he'd stood in that pawn shop, ready to give up. Thank you, Walter, he said quietly. Walter looked up from wiping paint. For what? For not giving up on me, for showing me there's still good in the world. Walter's eyes misted over, but his smile was bright. That's what family does, son. That's what family does. They sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by their creative chaos. While Grace played with paper scraps at their feet, the afternoon sun painted everything golden. And for once, Eli felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The town hall glowed like a warm beacon against the darkening Kentucky sky. Someone had strung fairy lights across the entrance, creating a gentle, welcoming sparkle that reminded Eli of fireflies on summer evenings. Inside, the usually stark municipal building had been transformed by their handmade decorations. Paper banners hung from the walls, and mason jars with tea lights dotted the folding tables. Grace toddled through the growing crowd in her tiny blue dress, one that Eli had found tucked away in Lydia's hope chest. Her dark curls bounced with each determined step, and her patent leather shoes clicked against the linoleum floor. Several of the townspeople stopped to coo at her, offering gentle waves that made her hide shyly behind Eli's legs before peeking out again with a giggle. "There's my girl," Walter called from across the room, making his way slowly through the crowd with his cane. He wore his best suit, pressed and neat, though the shoulders hung a bit loose on his aging frame. Grace immediately abandoned her hiding spot and wobbled toward him, arms outstretched. The room filled steadily with people, young mothers juggling diaper bags, elderly couples arm in arm, teenagers helping to carry platters of home-cooked food to the long buffet table. Eli recognized faces from the garage, the grocery store, the park where he took Grace to play. They weren't strangers anymore. They were neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, whose car he'd fixed last week, brought her famous apple pie. "On the house," she insisted, patting his arm. "You saved me a fortune on that transmission work." In the corner, Pastor David stood quietly, his usual confident posture somewhat subdued. He held a paper cup of punch and watched the proceedings with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met briefly across the room, Eli gave a small nod. David returned it after a moment's hesitation. At 7 o'clock, Walter cleared his throat into the microphone they'd borrowed from the church. The feedback made everyone wince, but his warm chuckle eased the moment. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "thank you for coming tonight. We're here to support each other, to remember that none of us walks alone." Eli's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter he'd brought. The paper was worn at the creases from how many times he'd read it over, practicing in front of his bathroom mirror. Grace sat contentedly in Walter's lap in the front row, playing with his tie clip. "Some of you knew my wife, Lydia," Eli began, his voice rough with emotion. He cleared his throat and started again, stronger this time. "Some of you only knew of her, but every day, I see her love living on in this community, in the kindness you've shown me and my daughter, in the way you've welcomed us back to life." The room grew still, faces turned toward him in the gentle light. Even the babies seemed to sense the moment, their usual fussing quieted to soft coos. "This is a letter I wrote to her last week," he continued, smoothing the paper. "Dear Lydia, today I understood something you tried to tell me long ago. Remember that morning at the farmer's market, when you gave our last $20 to that young mom whose car had broken down? I was so angry. We needed that money for groceries. But you just smiled and said, 'Faith isn't about waiting for miracles. It's about being one when you can.'" A few murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. Eli saw Mrs. Peterson dab at her eyes with a tissue. "I didn't understand then, but I do now. Because after you left us, when I was drowning in grief and bills and diapers, this town became our miracle. A bag of groceries appeared on our porch. Someone anonymously paid our electric bill. Walter." His voice caught for a moment. "Walter showed me that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up when you're broken." In the corner, David shifted, his hands tied around his paper cup, but he didn't leave. "You always said that love was like bread. It only multiplies when you share it. So that's what we're doing here tonight. We're sharing what we have, believing it will multiply. Maybe someone here needs a car fixed. Maybe someone else can offer childcare. Maybe we all just need to remember we're not alone." Eli looked up from his letter, taking in the faces before him. Faces that had become familiar. Faces that had begun to feel like home. Lydia's love didn't die with her. It lived on in every person who helped us, in every act of kindness that kept us going. And now, it lives on in what we do for each other. The silence that followed was full of sniffles and quiet nods. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started to clap. The applause spread like a wave, warm and genuine, until the whole room was filled with it. As Eli stepped down from the small platform, people came forward to hug him, to share their own stories of Lydia's kindness, to offer help and ask for it. A young single mother asked if he could look at her car's brakes. An elderly gentleman offered to babysit Grace one afternoon a week. Connections formed, phone numbers were exchanged, and the room buzzed with the energy of community being born. Walter made his way to Eli's side, Grace now sound asleep against his shoulder. His eyes were bright with tears and pride as he gripped Eli's shoulder firmly. "You've given this town something to believe in," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "something bigger than their own troubles." The morning sun streamed through Walter's kitchen windows, painting warm squares on the checkered tablecloth. Eli hummed softly as he measured coffee grounds into the old percolator, while Grace played with her stuffed bunny and her portable playpen. The night before still felt like a dream. The community gathering, the shared stories, the feeling of finally belonging somewhere again. "Best coffee in Kentucky," Walter declared from his seat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around yesterday's newspaper. You've got the magic touch, son. Eli grinned, reaching for the sugar bowl. Don't tell Mr. Jackson at the diner. He still thinks his is the best in town. That man wouldn't know good coffee if it… Walter's voice suddenly cut off with a sharp gasp. Eli turned at the strange sound. The newspaper slipped from Walter's fingers, scattering across the linoleum floor. Walter's face had gone ashen, his right hand clutching at his chest. Walter? Eli's voice cracked as he rushed to the old man's side. What's wrong? Walter tried to speak, but only managed a weak wheeze. His eyes were wide with fear, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. His fingers dug into the fabric of his flannel shirt. Hold on, Eli said, his hands shaking as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed 911, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear the operator's voice. 911? What's your emergency? My friend, Eli stammered, keeping one hand on Walter's shoulder. He's having chest pains. He can't breathe right. Please hurry. He rattled off Walter's address, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. Stay with me, Walter, Eli pleaded as they waited. The ambulance is coming. Just stay with me. The minutes crawled by like hours. Grace started crying, sensing the tension in the room. Eli wanted to comfort her, but couldn't leave Walter's side. He kept talking, saying anything that came to mind, desperate to keep Walter conscious. Remember how you taught me to fix that carburetor last week? You've got to stick around to teach me more, okay? Grace needs her grandpa Walter. When the paramedics finally arrived, their heavy boots thundering up the porch steps, Eli felt like he could barely breathe himself. They worked quickly, asking questions Eli could only partially answer. Yes, Walter had seemed tired lately. No, he hadn't mentioned previous heart problems. I'm riding with him, Eli announced, already gathering Grace into his arms. One of the paramedics nodded, helping them into the ambulance behind Walter's stretcher. The siren wailed as they sped through town, past the diner, past the church where they'd shared so many Sunday mornings. Walter looked small and fragile under the oxygen mask, his eyes closed. Eli held his hand, whispering prayers he thought he'd forgotten. At the hospital, everything became a blur of white walls and urgent voices. Doctors whisked Walter away, while Eli paced the waiting room, bouncing Grace gently as she fussed. He called David's number with trembling fingers, leaving a voicemail when there was no answer. Hours passed. Grace finally fell asleep in her carrier, exhausted from the morning's chaos. A doctor, with kind eyes and gray hair, finally approached, clipboard in hand. Mr. Turner? She asked softly. Mr. Dempsey is stable, but I'm afraid the news isn't good. He's experiencing severe heart failure. We're doing everything we can, but given his age and the extent of the damage. Eli sank into a nearby chair, his legs suddenly weak. Can I see him? The doctor nodded, leading him to a small room filled with beeping machines. Walter lay propped up on white pillows, looking pale but alert. His eyes brightened when he saw Eli. There's my boy, he whispered hoarsely. Eli carefully set Grace's carrier down and took Walter's hand. You scared me half to death, old man. Walter's fingers tightened weakly around his. Listen, son. David, he's going to be angry, hurting. Don't let him. He paused, catching his breath. Don't let him hate anymore, promise me. Before Eli could respond, rapid footsteps approached from the hallway. David burst into the room, his pastor's collar askew, face flushed with emotion. Dad! He cried. Then his eyes landed on Eli. His expression hardened instantly. What are you doing here? David, Walter started, but his son cut him off. This is your fault? David spat at Eli, his voice trembling. All these projects, all these activities, you've been wearing him out. He's 82 years old, for God's sake. David, please. Walter tried again, but started coughing. I was just trying to help, Eli said softly, stepping back from the bed. Help? David's laugh was bitter. You latched onto a lonely old man for his money and sympathy, and now look what's happened. The words hit Eli like physical blows. He looked at Walter, saw the pain and exhaustion in his face, and suddenly couldn't bear to be in the room anymore. Without a word, he picked up Grace's carrier and walked out, David's angry words following him down the hall. The automatic doors whooshed open, and Eli stepped into the evening air. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting pools of cold light across the parking lot. He stood there, Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier, and felt hot tears sliding down his cheeks. Everything he touched seemed to crumble. First Lydia, now Walter. Maybe David was right. Maybe he should have seen the signs, should have done less, should have protected Walter better. A car horn honked in the distance. The sound of ambulance sirens wailed, bringing another emergency, another family's worst day. Eli wiped his eyes with his sleeve and started walking toward his truck, each step heavy with the familiar weight of loss. The ring around his neck, Lydia's ring, the one that had started everything, felt like it was burning against his skin. He touched it through his shirt, remembering Walter's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. Some things aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be passed on. But right now, under the harsh glare of the hospital lights, Eli wasn't sure what he had left to pass on except grief. The kitchen light flickered dimly as Eli slumped at his worn wooden table, surrounded by a scattered mess of overdue bills. Their bright red final notice stamps seemed to mock him in the half-light. The eviction notice, stark white against his refrigerator door, felt like a knife in his heart. 3 months behind on rent, there was no more wiggle room. Grace's cries pierced the quiet night, her tiny voice full of discomfort. She'd been fussy all evening, probably sensing his distress. Eli pushed back from the table and lifted her from the playpen, cradling her close. "Shh, sweetheart," he whispered, bouncing her gently. "Daddy's here." But the truth stabbed at him. For how much longer? They had maybe 2 days' worth of formula left. The electricity bill was due tomorrow. His last paycheck had barely covered the basics. And now, with Walter in the hospital, Eli's eyes drifted to the small velvet box sitting on the counter. He'd promised himself he'd never do this again. The first time had nearly broken him, but Walter wasn't here to save them now, and pride wouldn't keep a roof over Grace's head. Grace hiccuped against his shoulder, her cries softening to whimpers. Eli pressed his lips to her downy head, breathing in her baby powder scent. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry." With trembling hands, he opened the box. The ring caught what little light there was, the small diamond still as bright as the day he'd slipped it onto Lydia's finger. He could still see her face, glowing with joy, as she'd said, "I do." Now he was about to break that promise for the second time. "Lydia," he whispered to the empty kitchen, "I don't know what else to do." The night seemed to press in around him as he gathered Grace's diaper bag and strapped her into her stroller. The walk to Jackson's pawn and trade felt longer than ever before, each step heavy with shame. The open sign buzzed faintly in the window, a harsh neon beacon in the gathering dark. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that familiar, sickly glow. Mr. Jackson looked up from his newspaper, recognition crossing his weathered face. He didn't say a word as Eli approached the counter. Grace had fallen asleep in her stroller, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Eli touched the soft curve of her face before reaching into his pocket for the box. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Mr. Jackson opened the box without comment, examining the ring with practiced eyes. He didn't mention that he'd seen this same ring twice before. Didn't bring up Walter's kindness or ask about the old man's health. Instead, he simply wrote out a ticket and counted out the cash less than last time, but enough to keep them housed for another month. The transaction passed in heavy silence. No judgment in the pawnbroker's eyes, just quiet understanding that somehow made it worse. Eli's throat felt too tight to speak as he pocketed the money. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. Eli pulled up the stroller's hood to keep Grace dry, but didn't bother protecting himself. The cold drops mixed with the tears he could no longer hold back as he started the long walk home. The empty box weighed like lead in his pocket. Each step felt like moving through mud, his heart as heavy as his feet. The streetlights cast long shadows through the rain, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times. Grace slept on, innocent and unaware, as Eli pushed her stroller through puddles beginning to form on the cracked sidewalk. The rain fell harder now, soaking through his thin jacket, but he barely noticed. His mind was full of Lydia, her smile, her faith, her unwavering belief that everything would work out if you just held on long enough. "I'm sorry, Lydia," he whispered into the rain, clutching the empty box in his pocket. "I'm so sorry." The wind picked up, carrying his words away into the darkness, leaving only the sound of rain and his footsteps as he pushed his daughter home through the gathering storm. The digital clock on Eli's microwave blinked 8:47 p.m. when he first noticed something was wrong. Grace's usual bedtime fussing had turned into a different kind of cry, higher pitched, more urgent. When he lifted her from her playpen, heat radiated through her yellow onesie. "Oh no, sweetie," he murmured, pressing his lips to her forehead. His heart sank at how hot she felt. Grace whimpered and buried her face in his neck, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt. The thermometer confirmed his fears, 102.3, too high for his baby girl. Eli's hand shook as he grabbed the diaper bag, his mind racing through everything he needed. Diapers, Wipes, her favorite blanket with the pink elephants, the one Lydia had picked out before. He pushed the thought away. No time for that now. The night air was thick with coming rain as Eli rushed to his car, carefully buckling Grace into her car seat. She cried harder at being put down, her face flushed and miserable. "Shh, baby girl," he soothed, though his own voice trembled. "We're going to make you feel better." The drive to Marshall County Urgent Care seemed endless. Every red light felt like torture as Grace's cries grew weaker. Eli kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The streets were nearly empty, scattered leaves skittering across the pavement ahead of the storm. The fluorescent lights of the clinic parking lot cast harsh shadows as Eli parked. Inside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. A tired-looking receptionist looked up from her computer. "Fill these out," she said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Insurance card?" Eli's stomach clenched. I don't have insurance right now. Lost it when." He swallowed hard. "How much is the visit?" The number she quoted made him dizzy. After pawning Lydia's ring, he had barely enough left. But what choice did he have? Grace felt like a furnace against his chest. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly, taking the clipboard. The plastic waiting room chairs were hard and uncomfortable. Eli filled out the forms one-handed, his other arm cradling Grace. Her crying had subsided to whimpering, but that worried him even more. His strong, usually energetic daughter seemed to be wilting. A mother across the room gave him a sympathetic look over her magazine. "First time with a fever?" "First time alone," Eli admitted, his voice rough. The woman nodded understanding and looked away, leaving him with his thoughts. Eli found himself doing something he hadn't done since Lydia's funeral: praying. Not the formal prayers he'd learned in church, but desperate whispers straight from his heart. "Please," he murmured into Grace's damp hair. "Please, let her be okay. I know I've messed up. I know I haven't been strong enough or good enough. But she's innocent. She's all I have left of Lydia. Please." Walter's words from their long talks on the porch came back to him. "Faith starts when you've got nothing left." Eli had nodded politely then, but now the words hit differently. Here in this sterile waiting room, watching his daughter struggle, he truly had nothing left. No money, no pride, no certainty, just love and fear and desperate hope. "I'll do better," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I promise, Lydia. I'll be the father she deserves. Just please let her be all right." Time crept by in the harsh fluorescent light. Grace dozed fitfully against his chest, her breathing quick and shallow. Outside, thunder rumbled, and rain began to patter against the windows. Eli remembered other stormy nights, Lydia curled against him, both of them dreaming of the family they would have. He'd never imagined he'd be doing this alone. When the nurse finally called them back, Eli's legs were numb from sitting still so long. The examination room was small and chilly. Grace whimpered as the nurse took her temperature and vital signs. 103.1 now, she noted. "How long has she had the fever?" "I noticed it about 2 hours ago," Eli said. "She was fine at dinner, but then..." The doctor came in shortly after, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair. She examined Grace thoroughly while Eli hovered nearby, answering questions about symptoms and recent activities. His throat tightened when she asked about family medical history. There was so much about Lydia's side he didn't know. "Looks like an ear infection," the doctor finally concluded. "Pretty common at this age, but we'll want to start antibiotics right away." Relief made Eli's knees weak. Just an ear infection. Not something worse. Not something he couldn't handle. The prescription she wrote would take most of his remaining money, but he didn't hesitate. Grace's comfort was all that mattered. While the nurse prepared discharge paperwork, Eli held his daughter close, breathing in her baby-sweet scent under the fever smell. Thunder crashed closer now, and rain drummed against the roof. Grace startled at the sound, clutching his shirt. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered. "Daddy's got you. We're gonna be just fine." He almost believed it himself. A thin line of golden light crept beneath the curtains as dawn broke over the small Kentucky town. Eli sat in his worn armchair, watching Grace's chest rise and fall as she finally slept peacefully on the couch. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her cheeks less flushed but her tiny body exhausted. The sound of paper sliding against wood made him turn. Through the gap under his apartment door, a white envelope appeared. Eli's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Grace to make sure she was still sleeping, then crossed the room in 3 quick strides. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. It was plain and unmarked, sealed with care. The paper felt expensive, Not the kind you'd find at the dollar store. Eli sank to the floor right there by the door, his back against the wall, and carefully opened it. Three things fell into his lap: a familiar pawn ticket, a thick fold of cash, and a note written in shaky but determined handwriting. Eli recognized it immediately. He'd seen those careful, old-fashioned letters in Walter's grocery lists and repair notes. Some things aren't meant to be sold, the note read. They're meant to be passed on. Eli's vision blurred as he counted the money with trembling fingers. $500 in crisp bills, more than enough to reclaim the ring and cover this month's rent. His throat tightened as he realized Walter must have arranged this before his collapse, knowing somehow that Eli would need it. "Oh, God," he whispered, pressing his palms against his eyes. The tears came anyway, hot and fast. He hadn't cried like this since Lydia's funeral. Great, heaving sobs that he muffled in his sleeve to avoid waking Grace. From the couch came a soft murmur. Eli quickly wiped his face and looked over. Grace had rolled onto her side, one small hand curled under her chin, still deep in healing sleep, just like her mother used to sleep. The morning light grew stronger, painting squares of gold on the worn carpet. Eli read the note again, tracing Walter's words with his finger. The old man's presence seemed to fill the room, his quiet wisdom, his stubborn kindness, his refusal to let hope die. Eli checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. Jackson's Pawn and Trade wouldn't open until 9, but he couldn't wait. He needed to move, to do something. He called Mrs. Martinez from next door, who had helped watch Grace before. "Of course I'll watch her, mijijo," she said warmly when he explained. "My Carlos was sick like that last month. She'll sleep for hours yet." After Mrs. Martinez arrived, Eli grabbed his keys and jacket. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Grace. The morning sun caught her dark curls, making them shine like her mother's used to. The streets were quiet as Eli drove to the pawn shop, past shuttered storefronts and early morning joggers. He parked across the street, watching the dark windows of Jackson's while the sun climbed higher. His hands kept returning to the envelope in his pocket, touching it to make sure it was real. At 8:45, Mr. Jackson's nephew started unlocking the front door. Eli was out of his truck before the closed sign had fully flipped to open. "We just opened," the nephew started to say, but Eli was already pulling out the pawn ticket. "The ring," he said, voice rough. "The wedding ring from yesterday. I need it back." The nephew blinked at Eli's intensity, but took the ticket. "Let me check with Uncle Jack." Eli paced the small shop while he waited, past shelves of tools and electronics, guitar cases, and old cameras. Each step felt like an eternity. Finally, Mr. Jackson himself emerged from the back room, holding the familiar velvet box. "Didn't expect to see this one again so soon," he said quietly, studying Eli's face. Eli placed the cash on the counter with shaking hands. "Please." Mr. Jackson opened the box, showing him the ring was still there, still perfect. The small diamond caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows across the glass counter. Lydia's ring. Their ring. The symbol of everything they'd shared and lost and found again. "She must have been something special," Mr. Jackson said softly as he counted out the money. "She was," Eli managed. "Her brother, he's something special too." The transaction complete, Eli stepped outside into the full morning Sunday. He opened the box one more time, just to be sure. The ring sat there, waiting to go home. He pressed it against his heart, feeling its solid reality through his shirt. "Thank you, old man," he whispered into the quiet street. The words felt insufficient for everything Walter had given him. Not just the money, but the reminder that love doesn't end. It changes hands. It finds new ways to shine. The hospital corridor stretched long and quiet in the late afternoon light. Eli's footsteps echoed against the polished floors as he made his way to room 412. His heart felt heavy, like it was made of lead. The smell of antiseptic and illness hung in the air, bringing back memories of Lydia's final days. Outside Walter's room, he paused to take a deep breath. Through the small window, he could see the old man propped up in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than ever against the stark white sheets. An IV dripped steadily beside him, and various monitors beeped softly in the background. "Come in, son," Walter called out weakly, having spotted Eli through the window. His voice was thin but warm like always. Eli stepped inside, clutching a paper bag. "Brought you some of those butterscotch candies you like?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And Grace drew you a picture." He pulled out a crayon scribble covered in bright colors. Walter's face lit up. Despite the oxygen tube in his nose and the pallor of his skin, his blue eyes still sparkled. "That little artist," he whispered, Put it right there where I can see it." He motioned to the bedside table. Eli carefully taped the drawing to the wall. Then he settled into the chair beside the bed, the plastic creaking under his weight. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from true understanding between two people. "I got your note," Eli finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the ring. Walter, you shouldn't have—" "Hush now," Walter interrupted gently. "What else was I going to do with my savings? Buy another fishing rod?" He chuckled, then coughed. "Besides, that ring belongs in your family." Eli leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You are my family now, too," he said quietly. Walter's eyes grew misty. "You know, when Lydia left," he paused, catching his breath, "I was so angry. Thought she was being selfish, running away from her responsibilities. But now I see she was running toward something better, toward love." He reached out with a trembling hand to grasp Eli's. "She found it with you. I wish she could have reconciled with you sooner," Eli said, his throat tight. "God's timing isn't always our timing," Walter replied. "But he brought us together now, didn't he? Through you and that precious baby girl." The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting stripes of golden light across the bed. Outside, birds chirped in the maple tree near the window. "Eli," Walter said suddenly, his voice growing serious, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Help David heal." Walter's grip tightened slightly on Eli's hand. "He's carried this bitterness about Lydia for so long. It's eating him up inside, just like it ate at me before I found you." Tears welled up in Eli's eyes. "I don't know if he'll let me," he admitted. "He will," Walter said with quiet certainty. "Because you understand loss. You understand grace." He took a shaky breath. "Show him what you showed me, that love is stronger than pride." Eli couldn't hold back his tears anymore. They fell freely as he nodded. "I promise," he whispered. Walter smiled, looking peaceful. "You know what I learned in the war?" he asked softly. "That sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting. It's forgiving. It's reaching out when everything in you wants to pull away." They talked quietly as the afternoon faded into evening. Walter shared more stories about Lydia as a little girl, about his late wife Margaret, about the way faith had carried him through his darkest days. His voice grew weaker, but his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. As night settled in, Walter's eyes began to droop. "I'm just going to rest my eyes a bit," he murmured. Eli stayed, holding the old man's hand as the monitors beeped steadily in the darkness. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medication. Through it all, Walter slept peacefully, his breathing growing slower and more shallow. In the deepest part of night, Walter's breathing changed. Eli pressed the call button, and nurses rushed in, but there was nothing to be done. Walter Dempsey slipped away quietly, still holding Eli's hand. Dawn began to break, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples outside the window. Eli sat in the growing light, still holding Walter's hand, now cold and still. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he watched the sun's first rays filter through the blinds, casting gentle stripes across the bed where his friend, his family, lay at peace. The wooden pews of Oak Ridge Baptist Church creaked under the weight of mourners dressed in black. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across tearful faces. Baby Grace sat quietly in her Aunt Martha's lap, playing with a small wooden cross necklace, while Eli straightened his borrowed tie in the front row. Pastor David stood at the pulpit, his shoulders rigid beneath his dark suit. The Bible lay open before him, but his eyes kept drifting to Walter's casket. Fresh flowers surrounded it, lilies and roses that filled the air with their sweet perfume. "My father," David began, his voice steady at first, "was a man who understood grace better than anyone I've ever known." He paused, shuffling the papers of his prepared sermon. He served his country in Korea, loved his wife Margaret for 52 years, and never missed a Sunday service. The congregation nodded, dabbing at their eyes with tissues. David's hands gripped the podium tighter, but what made him truly remarkable wasn't his perfect attendance or his service record. David's voice cracked slightly. It was his ability to love without conditions, to forgive without. He stopped, swallowing hard. Mrs. Henderson from the choir started sniffling loudly. Mr. Jackson, the pawn shop owner, stared at his hands. The church felt heavy with shared grief. "I thought I knew everything about being a good Christian," David continued, his composure slipping. "I preached about love every Sunday, but my father—" His voice broke completely. "My father lived it." Eli stood up slowly from his seat, the letter in his pocket feeling as heavy as his heart. He walked to the pulpit, each step echoing in the hushed church. David looked at him, tears streaming down his face. "May I?" Eli asked softly. David nodded, stepping aside. His shoulders shook as he took Eli's vacant seat in the front row. Eli pulled out the wrinkled paper, smoothing it against the wooden podium. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read. "Dear Walter," he started, his voice rough with emotion. "You once told me that love doesn't die, it just changes hands. I didn't understand what you meant until now." The church was silent, except for the gentle whir of ceiling fans and distant bird songs through the windows. "When I lost Lydia, I thought I'd lost everything. My faith, my hope, my reason for getting up in the morning. But you showed me that love leaves traces everywhere, in a borrowed cup of coffee, in an old truck that needs fixing, in the way Grace's eyes light up just like her mama's used to." Several people murmured in agreement. David lifted his head, watching Eli intently. "You taught me that being strong doesn't mean carrying your burdens alone. It means letting others help you carry them. You showed me that faith isn't about perfect attendance or memorized verses. It's about showing up for people when they need you most." Eli's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You gave me back my wife's ring when I thought I had to sell it. But more than that, you gave me back my dignity. You showed me that sometimes the biggest act of faith is simply believing tomorrow might be better than today." In the front row, David covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Martha patted his back gently while Grace reached for him with tiny hands. "I promised to tell Grace about her great-uncle Walter." Eli read, his voice thick with tears. "About how he fought in a war but never lost his gentleness. About how he could fix anything with duct tape and faith. About how he taught her daddy that love is stronger than pride. And family isn't just about blood, it's about choice." The sunlight shifted through the windows, painting rainbow patterns across Walter's casket. Eli gripped the podium tighter. "You were right, Walter. Love doesn't die. It lives in the stories we tell, in the mercy we show, in the hands we reach out to hold. Thank you for being my father when I'd forgotten how to be a son." Eli folded the letter with shaking hands. "In Jesus' name, amen, amen," the congregation echoed softly. David stood up, his face wet with tears. He walked to the pulpit where Eli still stood, and for a moment, they just looked at each other, two men broken by loss, but bound by love. Then David pulled Eli into a fierce embrace. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I was so wrong." Eli hugged him back, feeling decades of hurt and anger dissolving in their shared grief. Around them, the congregation sat in reverent silence, witnessing healing happen in real time. After the service, people filed out into the bright afternoon. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a gentle golden light over the church grounds. David and Eli walked side by side down the church steps, each lost in thought, but somehow united in their loss. Grace babbled happily in Eli's arms, reaching for the sunbeams that danced through the trees. Above them, a warm breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of spring and new beginnings. Autumn leaves danced across the newly painted sign outside Walter's old garage, the Grace Fund Community Support Center. The morning sun caught the fresh blue paint, making it gleam like a beacon of hope. Eli Turner stood in the gravel driveway, holding a wrench in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, watching as David Dempsey's pickup truck pulled in. "Morning," David called out, climbing down from his truck. He carried a box of donated groceries, his clerical collar replaced by a worn flannel shirt. "Got another delivery from Mrs. Henderson's garden. Says her tomatoes are coming in faster than she can use them." Eli smiled, setting his coffee down on a nearby workbench. "Those'll go perfect with the pasta we're giving out today." He reached for the box, catching the familiar scent of fresh vegetables. "How many families we expecting?" 7 signed up yesterday." David paused, adjusting his grip on the box. "Plus 2 more this morning. Single mothers. Both of them. One's got a minivan that's barely running." They carried the supplies inside, where they'd converted Walter's old workshop into a food pantry and community space. The concrete floors were still stained with decades of oil spots, but now cheerful posters and children's artwork covered the walls. A play area filled one corner, complete with donated toys and a soft rug where babies could crawl safely. "Dad would have loved this," David said softly, arranging cans on metal shelving. "Using his space to help people. It's exactly what he always wanted to do." Eli nodded, thinking of the letter Walter had left with his will. The old man had set aside his life savings specifically for this purpose, helping struggling parents get back on their feet. The memory of Walter's scratchy handwriting still brought tears to Eli's eyes. Sometimes God's grace comes with a wrench and a helping hand. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Eli worked under the hood of a battered Honda while David organized the day's food distribution. Local volunteers filtered in and out, dropping off donations or helping sort supplies. The garage echoed with conversation and occasional laughter. Around noon, Sarah Mitchell arrived with her 3 kids, her minivan coughing and sputtering into the parking lot. Eli wiped his hands on a shop rag and went to meet her. "Sounds like timing belt's about shot," he said, listening to the engine's uneven rhythm. "We can fix that today, no charge." Sarah's eyes welled up. "I can't accept." "Yes, you can," David interrupted gently, appearing beside them. "That's what we're here for." Walter's legacy. While Eli worked on the van, David helped Sarah fill 2 boxes with groceries. Her youngest daughter found her way to the play area, where Grace was stacking blocks with another toddler. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the metallic clinks of Eli's tools. "You know what this reminds me of?" David asked later, as they watched another family drive away with repairs done and food in their trunk. "Those stories Aunt Lydia used to tell, about wanting to open a place where people could just breathe, where they didn't have to pretend everything was okay." Eli paused, wrench mid-turn. "She talked about that?" "All the time, when we were kids." David leaned against the workbench. "Before she left, she had this dream of creating a space where people could be real about their struggles. I used to think it was just rebellion against our church's rigidness, but now I see what she meant." The afternoon sun slanted through the garage's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. More families came and went. Eli fixed transmissions and brake pads, while David handled the emotional and spiritual support many needed just as desperately. They worked in harmony, 2 men brought together by loss but united by purpose. Between repairs, Eli caught glimpses of Grace playing with the other children. She'd grown so much in these past months, toddling confidently now, offering toys to newer kids with a generosity that made his heart ache. She had Lydia's smile, that same instinct to reach out to others. A young single father came in, looking lost and overwhelmed, just as Eli had been not so long ago. David welcomed him while Eli checked his car's engine. They tag-teamed the support, practical help paired with understanding ears and gentle encouragement. The man left standing taller, his eyes clearer. "You're good at this," David commented, watching Eli explain basic car maintenance to a teenage mom. "The way you make people feel seen." Eli shrugged, but warmth spread through his chest. "Learn from the best. Your dad had a way of making everybody feel worthy." "So did Lydia," David added softly. "I'm starting to remember that now." As the day wound down, Eli stood in the doorway of the garage, watching Grace play with 2 other toddlers in the late afternoon light. They were building towers with soft blocks, squealing with delight when they toppled over. His vision blurred with tears, but they weren't the bitter kind he'd grown used to. These were grateful tears, full of wonder at how life could circle back to hope. Grace looked up and spotted him watching. "Data!" she called, waving a block in triumph. The simple joy in her voice echoed off the walls, filling the space with something that felt like blessing. Eli pressed his hand to his chest, where Lydia's ring hung on a chain under his shirt. The metal was warm against his skin, a constant reminder of love's persistence. He could almost hear her laugh, see her nodding in approval at what this place had become. The Grace Fund wasn't just about fixing cars or distributing food. It was about continuing what Walter and Lydia had both believed in, that love was meant to be passed on, that grace could wear 1,000 different faces. Sometimes it looked like a repaired transmission or a box of groceries. Sometimes it looked like a safe place for children to play while their parents received help without judgment. Grace toddled over to help another child who had fallen, patting their back with tiny hands. Eli watched through tears as his daughter, named for the very thing that had saved him, became part of healing someone else's hurt. Springtime painted the town square in soft pastels, transforming the weathered brick buildings and cracked sidewalks into something magical. Cherry blossoms dotted the grass like fallen snow, their delicate pink petals creating a carpet that rustled underfoot. Children chased butterflies between picnic blankets spread across the emerald lawn, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of church bells. A gentle breeze carried the rich scent of fresh-baked pies cooling on windowsills, and the sweet perfume of blooming flowers through the warm afternoon air. Under the old oak tree where Walter used to sit every morning with his coffee and well-worn Bible, telling stories to anyone who'd stop and listen, stood a simple wooden podium that David had crafted himself. The wood was smooth and golden, carved with care from boards salvaged from Walter's old workshop. Photos of Walter's smiling face decorated a nearby memorial board, images spanning decades. There he was in his crisp army uniform, young and serious with determination in his eyes. Another showed him holding baby Grace for the first time, his weathered hands so gentle around her tiny form. A third captured him bent over the hood of his old Chevy, grease on his fingers and contentment on his face. Someone had written, "In loving memory of Walter Dempsey, a man who lived Grace," across the top in careful silver letters that caught the dappled sunlight. Eli adjusted his tie, the same navy blue one Walter had pressed into his hands months ago, saying every man needed at least one good tie for special occasions. His fingers fumbled with the knot, remembering how Walter had patiently shown him the proper way to tie it that first Sunday morning. Now he watched Grace toddle through the grass in her bright yellow sundress, the one that brought out the golden flecks in her eyes. She giggled with pure delight, reaching for dandelion seeds floating past her face like tiny parachutes. Her chubby fingers grasped at the air, missing the seeds but not caring one bit. His heart squeezed tight at how much she looked like Lydia when she smiled. That same mischievous spark, that same joy in simple moments. "Ready?" David asked softly, stepping up beside him. The pastor wore casual clothes today, just well-worn jeans and a blue plaid shirt that had seen better days. Gone was the starched collar and pressed slacks, the rigid formality that had once defined him like armor. That distant, judgmental man had softened into something warmer, more genuine, more human. The lines around his eyes spoke of tears shed and forgiveness found. "As I'll ever be," Eli replied, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. The edges were worn soft from countless revisions, countless late nights spent writing and rewriting by lamplight while Grace slept. Some words had been crossed out and replaced, others added in the margins as memories surfaced. The crowd gathered slowly like a gentle tide, settling onto quilted blankets and mismatched folding chairs that had been borrowed from the church basement. Mrs. Henderson from the diner moved through the group with maternal efficiency, passing out mason jars of fresh lemonade and homemade cookies. Her apron was dusted with flour, evidence of the morning spent baking in Walter's honor. Mr. Jackson from the pawn shop sat near the back on a folding chair. His usually gruff demeanor softened as he nodded respectfully at Eli. Even Mike, the usually gruff auto parts supplier who rarely spoke more than necessary, had shown up with his wife and twin boys, all of them dressed in their Sunday best. David stepped up to the simple podium first, his hands resting gently on the smooth wood. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "We're here today to remember my father, Walter Dempsey, a man who served his country with honor, loved his family with his whole heart, and touched more lives than he ever knew." He paused, scanning the faces before him, faces that had become dear to him over these past months. But more than that, we're here to celebrate how one man's kindness can ripple outward, changing not just individual lives, but an entire community. His eyes found Eli's, and he smiled with genuine warmth. "I'll let someone who experienced that kindness firsthand share a special message that I think Dad would have loved to hear." Eli scooped up Grace from where she'd been exploring a patch of clover, her little sundress now decorated with grass stains and flower petals. She settled contentedly against his chest, one small hand tangling in his shirt collar as he walked to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter, but when he looked out at the sea of expectant faces, faces that had once been strangers but were now family, his voice found its strength. "Dear Grace," he began, his words carrying across the quiet square, "there are some stories you need to know when you're old enough to understand them. Stories about love and faith and second chances, about how broken things can be made beautiful again. Your mama believed in all three of those things with her whole heart." He paused, looking at the faces before him. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The young mother from the grocery store held her toddler a little tighter. Even tough, Mike wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Your mama, Lydia, had the kind of smile that could light up the darkest room and make you believe everything would be okay. She loved yellow flowers because they reminded her of sunshine. She made the best raspberry pie in 3 counties, though she'd burn the edges every single time and laugh about it. She sang off-key in the shower every morning, these old hymns her grandmother taught her, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world." Several people wiped their eyes openly now. David's wife, Sarah, squeezed his hand tightly, remembering her own first impression of the aunt she'd never met but had come to love through stories. She left her family when she was just 18, carrying hurt too heavy for such young shoulders. Sometimes families say things they don't mean, hold grudges that grow like weeds until they choke out all the love. But your mama never stopped believing in grace, the kind that forgives everything and starts fresh every morning. The breeze picked up, rustling through the oak leaves overhead with a sound like gentle applause. Grace reached toward the dancing shadows, her eyes wide with wonder. Then we met Walter, your great uncle, though neither of us knew it at first. God has a sense of humor sometimes, baby girl. He found us when we were broken, when I'd lost my way and my faith and didn't know how to be strong anymore. Walter didn't just give us money or food, though he did that too. He gave us something more precious. He gave us dignity, hope, family. Grace reached for the paper in his hands, and the audience chuckled warmly as Eli gently moved it away from her curious grasp, kissing the top of her head. Walter taught me that sometimes God's answers come wearing old work boots and carrying a toolbox full of wisdom. He showed me that real faith isn't about perfect people living perfect lives. It's about broken ones helping each other heal, piece by piece, day by day. David nodded, tears streaming freely down his face now, all his old pride washed away by grief and gratitude. Your mama's wedding ring hangs around your neck now, baby girl, on that little gold chain Walter bought special just for you. It's not just jewelry. It's a reminder that love comes back to us in the most unexpected ways, through the most unexpected people. Walter knew that truth better than anyone. He lived it every single day of his life. Eli's voice cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through despite his efforts to stay strong. He called you his second chance, Grace, said God had given him another shot at loving family the right way, the way he should have loved your mama all those years ago. And he did. He loved you, loved us, with everything he had left in his old heart. The breeze rustled through the oak leaves overhead again, almost like a whisper of approval, and several people looked up as if expecting to see Walter himself sitting on his favorite branch. So when you're older and you ask about this ring, about Walter, about your mama, I'll tell you this story. I'll tell you that some people leave footprints on our hearts that never fade, no matter how much time passes. They teach us that grace isn't something we earn through good behavior or perfect attendance at church. It's given freely, like Walter gave to us, like your mama gave to me every day of our marriage. People were standing now, drawn forward by the raw honesty in his words, by the love that radiated from this young father holding his daughter close. Your mama believed in heaven, Gracie. She'd tell you all about streets of gold and mansions and no more tears. And now she's there with Walter, probably arguing about whose turn it is to make the coffee and whether his war stories are getting taller with each telling. A warm laugh rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. But more importantly, they both taught us how to live here now, in this broken, beautiful world, with open hearts and helping hands, and love that never gives up. Eli looked up from the letter, meeting the tear-filled eyes of his neighbors, his community, his chosen family. Walter used to say, love doesn't die, it just changes hands. He was right. Look around, Grace. This is what love looks like when it's passed on from person to person, heart to heart. This is Walter's real gift to all of us. David walked up without hesitation and hugged Eli hard, all the old anger and resentment buried forever under forgiveness and shared grief. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Dad would be so proud of you, of this, of what you've built here. The crowd moved forward like a gentle wave, eager to share their own stories and memories. Mrs. Henderson talked about Walter's weekly breakfast orders at the diner. Always eggs over easy with extra toast for dunking, and he'd sit at the corner booth reading his paper and greeting everyone who walked through the door. Mike mentioned how Walter would spend entire afternoons in his auto parts shop, not buying anything, just telling war stories to anyone who'd listen, and somehow making even the youngest customers feel important. Children played tag between the adults' legs, while plates of homemade food appeared as if by magic. Casseroles and fried chicken, fresh bread and fruit salad, enough to feed twice as many people. Grace toddled from person to person with fearless curiosity, receiving cookies and gentle pats and bits of wisdom whispered in her tiny ears. The ring bounced against her chest as she moved, catching sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows that danced across her yellow dress. Eli watched it all with a deep sense of peace settling in his chest, like a bird coming home to roost. Here was Walter's real legacy, not in buildings or bank accounts or monuments of stone, but in a community drawn together by love. In a faith renewed not through perfect sermons or flawless theology, but through simple acts of kindness multiplied and shared. David caught his eye across the crowd and grinned, looking more like the boy he must have been before life taught him to build walls. Ready to open the community center tomorrow? Already got 3 cars lined up in the garage. Eli nodded. Single moms who need repairs they can't afford. Walter would have loved that we're starting with the ones who need it most. He's probably looking down right now, complaining that we're not moving fast enough. David laughed. And for a moment, Eli could almost hear Walter's voice carried on the spring breeze. As the afternoon waned and shadows grew longer, people began the slow process of packing up blankets and collecting empty plates and folding chairs. Eli helped wherever he could, shaking hands and accepting hugs as the crowd gradually thinned. Each goodbye came with promises to stop by the garage, to bring the grandkids around to meet Grace, to remember Walter's lessons about living with open hands. Finally, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, it was time to head home. Eli lifted Grace onto his shoulders, her little hands immediately reaching up to pat his head as she settled in for the ride. The ring glinted at her throat, a familiar sparkle in the fading light, carrying with it all the love and hope and second chances that had brought them to this moment. The town square grew quiet, except for the rustle of cherry blossoms in the evening breeze. But the love that had filled it would linger long after the last footstep faded away. The desk lamp cast a warm glow across Eli's small study. Outside his window, the Kentucky night wrapped the world in velvet darkness, peaceful and still. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, his hand hovering over it for a moment before pressing pen to page. The scratching of his ballpoint filled the quiet room as he began to write. Dear Lydia, it's been a while since my last letter. So much has happened, I hardly know where to begin. But tonight, my heart feels full enough to burst, and I need to tell you everything. His pen moved steadily across the paper as memories flooded back. The sound of crickets filtered through the screen window, nature's gentle accompaniment to his thoughts. Remember how scared I was when Grace was born? How I worried I couldn't be both mother and father to her? Well, something amazing happened. Your brother Walter, the one you never spoke about, he found us. Or maybe you led him to us. Either way, he changed everything. Eli paused, wiping moisture from his eyes with the back of his hand. The words flowed easier now, like a river finding its path. He was everything you said a big brother should be, kind, wise, and full of terrible jokes. He taught me that strength isn't about carrying burdens alone. It's about letting others help you carry them. In the next room, Grace stirred briefly in her sleep. Eli listened for a moment, making sure she settled, before continuing. Walter passed away last week. Peaceful, in his sleep, holding my hand. His last words were about you, about how proud you'd be of the family we've become. I wish you could have seen him with Grace. The way his eyes lit up every time she toddled over to him, arms raised for a hug. She might not remember him when she's older, but I'll make sure she knows his stories. He reached for his coffee mug, now cold and forgotten. The night deepened around him, but he barely noticed, lost in his words. Your nephew David, he's different now. The day Walter died, something broke open in him. All that anger he carried about you leaving, it just melted away. We stood together at the funeral, and he hugged me like a brother. Said he finally understood why you had to go, why you chose love over duty. He's helping me run a program for single parents now. We call it the Grace Fund. Walter would have loved that. The old floorboards creaked softly as Eli shifted in his chair. From somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. I keep thinking about that day in the pawn shop when I tried to sell your ring. How desperate and ashamed I felt. But now I understand. That moment wasn't about losing something. It was about finding everything. Finding family. Finding faith again. Finding the strength to keep going. His pen moved faster now, trying to keep pace with his heart. Grace wears your ring on a chain now, just until she's old enough to understand what it means. Sometimes I catch her playing with it, watching it sparkle in the sunlight. In those moments, I see you in her smile, hear you in her laugh. She's got your spirit, Lydia. That same fire that made me fall in love with you. The crickets outside seemed to grow louder, their chorus a reminder of countless summer nights spent on the porch with Walter, sharing stories and healing hearts. I want you to know that I'm okay now. Really okay. Not just getting by, but living again. The garage is doing well. The community that once whispered behind our backs now brings us casseroles and babysits. Grace, your brother taught me that grief doesn't have to be a permanent address. It's just a stop along the way. Eli paused, watching a moth dance around the desk lamp. His throat tightened as he wrote the next words. The thing is, Lydia, I finally understand what you kept telling me before you left us. About how love is bigger than death. How it finds new ways to show itself. You were right, sweetheart. Love doesn't die, it just changes hands. He folded the letter carefully, creasing each edge with precision. Rising from his desk, he placed it beside the velvet ring box that had started everything, the box that had led him to Walter, to healing, to hope. The night air felt cool on his face as he stepped out onto the porch. Stars scattered across the dark Kentucky sky like diamond dust, reminding him of all those nights Walter had pointed out constellations to Grace. From inside, he could hear her soft giggles in her sleep, the sound of innocent dreams and untroubled rest. Eli gripped the porch railing, his eyes lifting to the heavens. The same stars that had watched over his pain now witnessed his healing. The same moon that had seen his tears now illuminated his smile. "We're going to be okay, Lydia," he whispered into the night. "We're really going to be okay." Above him, the stars continued their ancient dance, while below, the Kentucky hills waited patiently for dawn. Through the darkness, the first hints of morning began to paint the horizon in shades of promise, each color a testament to faith restored and love reborn. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Eli Turner, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.